the Horizon Guarantee. We have done that to ensure that there is no loss of funding for the UK science sector. I think it is far more important to speak directly to researchers and businesses and taxpayers on our commitment to getting the right deal than it is to be engaging here in party politics.
We're at Clubhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We in Bath have two fantastic universities, Bath University, Bath Spa University, and their leaders continue to worry about losing talent from Europe. The government have worsened this by proposing a 66% increase in visa fees. Will she explain why what this increase will mean for UK science and how it fits with the government's stated ambition to bring the best and brightest to this country?
Mr. Speaker, we continue to run a range of successful talent programmes that do bring the best and the brightest to universities and indeed to those in her constituency, and I welcome her representing them here today. But the point is this: we do have to get the right deal on Horizon, as I've laid out, and we do also have to strike a balance with the needs of policy across government. That is what she has heard from this dispatch box, from me and from other ministers, and that is how we will ensure to get the right deal for Britain, both in terms of talent and in terms of science programmes.
Sir Oliver Hill.
Will my right honourable friend agree with me that it's very much in Europe's interests for us to be part of the Horizon programme, because we have some of the strongest academic institutions in Europe, and in a way it undermines the science base of Europe if we're not in there. But will she also recognise that at the recent meeting of the UK-EU Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, although there was great enthusiasm for us to join again, there was also a feeling that surely it could be done a little more quickly?
Mr. Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's insight into this, and as I have already said, we are working consistently and steadily to be able to get the right deal for UK science, and by which we mean British researchers, as well as I've said, taxpayers and businesses. That is what we are doing. The talks are proceeding, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the House being able to have an update very soon.
Saki Batty.
Speaker, I'd like to put on record my respect for the Secretary of State and her excellent stewardship of her portfolio. I'd like to join Horizon Europe. I'd like for us to join Horizon Europe, but isn't it right that we get the right deal for our UK scientists, our UK businesses and our UK taxpayers? And any commentary before the deal is done would only undermine our science industry and is not helpful in the slightest.
Mr. Speaker, this is exactly right, and it's right for two reasons. The first is that actually billions of pounds of taxpayers' money are at stake, and we need to be responsible stewards of that. That is why we are focused on getting the right deal. The second point is this: my department exists to be able to forward and further the frontier of science in this country and to make sure that we stay a science and technology superpower. My friend knows exactly why that is.
Order. We're in the middle of a question. OK. Vicky Ford.
Speaker, Teledyne and ETV are the world leader in space imaging. They provide the eyes to NASA, to the European Space Programme and Copernicus. So can my great and right honourable friend make sure that our conversations about Horizon also include Copernicus? Otherwise, the EU is going to be building Earth observation satellites that can't see the Earth.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's interest in this area, and she's absolutely right that we have enormous opportunity in our space sector across a range of aspects. I welcome her interest. I know that my honourable friend, the Minister, would like to discuss further with her her interest from her constituency, and I can also assure the House that there will be further updates coming soon on the UK government's space strategy.
The Minister Chiomwara.
Thank you. In Vilnius, the Prime Minister had the chance to conclude a deal allowing our scientists to participate in the world's biggest international science programme, driving innovation and sustainable growth. He did not take it again. And so the Horizon saga drags on month after month, year after year. Are we in or are we out? The Science Minister isn't in the negotiations. The Chief Scientist isn't in the negotiations. It's all about the Prime Minister. So does the Minister understand that while the Prime Minister is dithering, our science base is withering?
Mr. Speaker, Today is quite possibly my last opportunity at a dispatch box. I first served from these government benches in May 2010, and the Honourable Lady first shadowed me 10 years ago, Mr. Speaker. I know she has a very fine mind and she's a dedicated public servant. However, on this she is wrong. The Labour frontbench may not know from one day to the next what their policy is. But, Mr. Speaker, we have been consistent on this point, and we are working hard to get that correct deal for UK taxpayers and UK science.
We come to topical Theresa Villiers.
Topical question number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since I last updated the House, my right honourable friend, the Minister for Data and Digital Infrastructure, has announced £318 million of funding to bring the fastest internet speeds to some of our most rural communities. The Government Office for Life Sciences has agreed a landmark deal with BioNTech that will see up to 10,000 cancer patients benefiting from potentially life-saving treatments. And today, Mr. Speaker, my department has launched a call for evidence on engineering biology.
What action is the government taking to deliver regulatory reform and business investment in the biosciences sector so this can play its part in boosting economic growth and delivering great job opportunities for people around the country?
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome my right honourable friend's expertise in this area, and can I also take the opportunity to thank the team that works with me here, including my honourable friend, who has been central in leading the way that we will reform our regulatory landscape on life sciences. And can I also point my right honourable friend to the announcements by the Chancellor at the budget and still to come that are about how we will continue to support our life sciences and bioscience sector, because it is essential in the UK economy.
To the Secretary of State, Lucy Poll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for her time covering this role, notwithstanding her answer to my colleague from Newcastle Central, who asked a very important question, I thought. But today's inflation figures confirm that prices continue to rise. Broadband customers are dealing with inflation-busting price hikes as a direct result of her government's choices. They lifted the cap on wholesale costs, which has caused retail prices to rise. So will the Secretary of State apologise to hard-pressed families and tackle the cost of living crisis for broadband customers?
Minister.
We recognise that households are having a very difficult time under the cost of living, which is why my right friend the Chancellor has met with regulators to press them to do more to help. But we have got agreement that social tariffs are now available to all those who are in receipt of universal credit and other benefits, and at the same time Ofcom have agreed with providers that anybody who wishes to switch to a cheaper tariff can do so without charge.
Sir Edward Lee.
There can be few more exciting and innovative projects for any constituency than a spaceport to launch satellites into space. We had a done deal to build one on the runway at RAF Scampton before the Home Office marched in and stymied the whole project. Will the Minister please lobby the Home Office to try and get the runway back a spaceport? Why would the Home Office want a runway? Or is there some darker purpose behind this?
Well, my right honourable friend has raised this before, and I will happily come and speak to him about it and support that space cluster. The UK is poised to lead Europe in the launch of low Earth orbit satellites over the coming decade, and we're building launch pads around the country for that very purpose.
Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Royal Society shows that visa cost analysis in 2021, researchers entering the UK via the Global Talent System had to pay 6 times that of similar international science schemes. Does the Minister acknowledge the cost of Brexit in failing to attract world-leading researchers and skilled workers?
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman is just on his own particular mission there. What he's failing to see is the strength of the UK science and technology sector, and indeed he fails to see that it will be a better future for Scotland's businesses and scientists and citizens to continue to be part of that thriving sector. That is what we are doing in making sure that the United Kingdom is a science and technology superpower.
Vital fabricant, Sir Michael.
Indeed, following on from that answer, we have world-class universities in the West Midlands. So can I ask my right honourable friend, what plans does he or she have in order to support regional innovation clusters there?
And makes an important point. We're investing heavily in regional innovation clusters all around this country. One in Manchester, one in Glasgow, and one in the West Midlands, where the excellent Mayor Andy Street is driving a genuine innovation economy.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almost 1 in 2 properties in my constituency of Blaydon do not have access to gigabit broadband, and that's less than 1 in 5 in rural areas. They don't even have superfast connections. The department must help properties get connected where profit incentives are low. So will the Minister provide an update on the gigabit voucher scheme and the total value of vouchers claimed this year?
Well done. Can I say to the Honourable Lady that currently over 76% of premises have access to gigabit-capable broadband, and we're on track to meet our target of 85% coverage by 2025. However, she raises a good point about take-up of social tariffs under the scheme, and we do want to see that happen much more. But we are determined to press ahead with Project Gigabit to achieve our target of universal coverage by 2030.
We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. I call Sajid Javid.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the ban on LGBT people serving in our military until the year 2000 was an appalling failure of the British state, decades behind the law of this land. As today's report makes clear, in that period, many endured the most horrific sexual abuse and violence, homophobic bullying and harassment, all while bravely serving this country. Today, on behalf of the British state, I apologise. And I hope all those affected will be able to feel proud parts of the veteran community that has done so much to keep our country safe. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Sajid Javid. Mr. Speaker, can I associate myself with the remarks the Prime Minister just made? Mr. Speaker, in the UK, every 90 minutes, someone sadly takes their own life. Indeed, in this country, for men under the age of 50 and for women under the age of 35, this is now the biggest killer. When I was the Secretary of State for Health, I met many brave families and campaigners, and I committed to them that the government would publish a comprehensive, cross-departmental suicide prevention strategy. That was over a year ago, and still no strategy. Now, I know that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, cares as deeply about this issue as I do. We've discussed it many times, and can I ask him, please, if he would commit his government to publishing this strategy within days of Parliament's return from the summer recess?
Mr. Speaker, when someone takes their own life, the effect on their family and friends is devastating. And I know the loss of my right honourable friend's own brother was an enormous source of pain for him. I want to reassure him that we are actively addressing suicide rates through our national suicide prevention strategy, backed by funding, and also particularly rolling out 100 suicide prevention voluntary community and social enterprises. But I can tell him that we will publish the new updated national suicide prevention strategy later this year.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, Labour in government was proud to repeal the ban against LGBT+ people serving in our armed forces. And today we strongly welcome this apology from the Prime Minister as a recognition of their historic mistreatment. Mr. Speaker, my constituent Ken Wright was a proud RAF serviceman, forced to leave the job he loved simply because he was gay. I'm delighted he is here today to witness this apology. And whilst we cannot right the wrongs of the past, the Government should now act on the recommendations of the Etherton Review to fix the lives broken by the ban. It's what LGBT plus veterans deserve. Mr. Speaker, I also know the whole House will want to send our very best wishes to the Lionesses as they start their World Cup campaign this Saturday. Let's hope they continue the brilliant success they had in the Euros. Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister took office 9 months ago, the NHS waiting list had 7.2 million people on it. What's the number today?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reason that the NHS waiting lists are higher today than they were then, after actually being stable for the first few months as we put in place new initiatives, is very simple, and that's because the NHS has been disrupted by industrial action, Mr. Speaker. Now, we've put very clear plans in place to bring down waiting lists in urgent and emergency care, in primary care, in ambulances and outpatients and electives. Those plans were working and will continue to work, but we do need to end the industrial action. So I'd ask the honourable gentleman, if he does care about bringing the waiting list down, does he agree with me that consultants and junior doctors should accept the pay deal that the government offered?
Mr. Speaker,
The Prime Minister likes to get away early. The more that you stop me getting on with the questions, the more I'm going to keep him here. So it's up to you how long you want the Prime Minister. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House is pleased that he's graced us with his presence today. But we don't get any more answers when he's here than when he's not. He knows the answer. 7 million people currently on the waiting list. Prime Minister, that's the highest it's ever been. It means that since he stepped foot into Downing Street, 100,000 people have been waiting in daily agony for things like hip and knee replacements, while he boasts. Has he figured out why, after 9 months, dozens of gimmicks, umpteen broken promises, his government is failing more patients than ever before?
Mr. Speaker, again, I don't think we heard an answer to the question, right?
And also, I don't want you holding up proceedings, Prime Minister.
It's very simple. If the honourable gentleman actually looked at what was happening earlier this year, what we have seen actually is that our plans were beginning to work. Ambulance and waiting times down from an hour and a half over Christmas to around half an hour. Virtually eliminating the number of people waiting 1.5 years for treatment, making huge progress on GP access. Now, all those things, all those plans we put in place, all the funding, all the extra ambulances, the extra discharge, all starting to make a difference, all held up by one very simple fact: industrial action in the NHS. Now, again, I'll give him a second chance. If he really wants to get people the health care that they want, will he agree with me that those doctors should accept the recommendations of the independent pay review body?
It will be a bad time to get thrown out. It's 6 weeks, I think, long and hard. Can I just say to the Prime Minister, it's opposition questions, it's Prime Minister's questions. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I think with his time away, he's slightly forgotten how this works. And he talks about his plans. He talks about his plans, his NHS staffing plan. He doesn't need to lecture me.
Order. It might be the last one before recess, but I'd just say to somebody, if they really want to take and go early, it will be very tempting to ensure that we do it. But think long and hard before you do. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He talks about his plans. He doesn't need to lecture me on that. On the NHS staffing plan, he nicked it from Labour. Yes. It's the same old story. They mess up the NHS and look to Labour to fix it. Come the election, the country will be doing the same. The difference is that, unlike us, he hasn't said how he'd pay for his workforce plan. Now's his chance. Where's the money coming from?
Mr. Speaker, not only is the NHS long-term workforce plan fully funded, it was welcomed by not one, not two, but by 43 different NHS stakeholders, Mr. Speaker. But no, he talks about our plans and are they making a difference? Well, let's just look. Let's just look in urgent and emergency care. Our plans mean that we'll put 800 more ambulances on the road, 5,000 more beds, faster discharge, more community care. That's why the Royal College of Emergency Medicine described it as significant and that it will undoubtedly improve conditions. But that's why, Mr. Speaker, what have we seen? A&E waiting times in England, the best in 2 years, Mr. Speaker. While, Mr. Speaker, and they won't like this, while the NHS has the worst waiting times in the country in Wales, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, when he said the workforce plan was fully costed, I've never seen the Chancellor more bewildered. It's less than a year since his party crashed the economy with their unfunded spending commitments, and he hasn't learned a thing. So let me ask it another way. Is his uncosted spending coming from more tax rises, more cuts, or is it just the latest promise to fall from the Tories' magic money tree?
Mr. Speaker, as I and the Chancellor set out, the plan is fully funded. He'll see that at the autumn statement. But I am pleased. I am pleased he's now interested in fiscal responsibility, because that is very welcome, Mr. Speaker. Because there's an opportunity for us to make sure that this is true conviction. We've just had, Mr. Speaker, in the last week, we've had the recommendations of independent pay review bodies, including for the NHS. Now, I believe the right thing to do was to accept those independent recommendations, but that involves taking difficult and responsible decisions to deliver those pay rises without fueling borrowing, inflation, taxes and debt. But on this crucial issue, Mr. Speaker, while his MPs are back on the picket lines, yet again on this issue, he simply refuses to take a position. It's the same old story. He should stop taking inspiration from his friends outside and unglue himself from the fence.
Who wants to lead the exit? Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, in that burst of nonsense, what you didn't hear was a single word about how he's going to be paying for it. Labour's NHS workforce plan is fully funded by scrapping the non-dom status that he so adores. You know the one, that non-dom...
Order. I think one or two of you have asked to catch my eye. You're not going the right way. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour's workforce plan is fully funded by scrapping the non-dom status that he so adores. You know the one, the non-dom tax thing, as he calls it, that allows some of the wealthiest people in the country to avoid paying tax here. Is that loophole so important to him that he'd rather have billions in unfunded promises than simply making billionaires pay what they owe?
Mr. Speaker, the same policy that has paid, I think, for 5 different things at this point. I think, Mr. Speaker, everybody knows that I'm a fan of doing maths to 18, but the honourable gentleman makes a very strong case for doing maths all the way to 61, quite frankly. When it comes, Mr. Speaker, but when it comes to the substance of the plan, because it's important we address this, right? I am aware, actually, and I will say this. He did set out some proposals to train more staff. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, that's all he did. Our plan is much more comprehensive and it's much more impactful, because not only will we train more staff, Mr. Speaker, well, no, this is important substance, because I acknowledge the party opposite did set out some plans to train more, but that's not enough. You also have to set out plans, as we did, to retain more NHS staff. And you also crucially have to set out plans to how you reform the NHS so that you can have a more productive NHS. And that is the difference between us, Mr. Speaker. He is only ever focused on the superficial headline. We're getting on and doing the actual reform.
Mr. Speaker, if he's so good at maths, he'd know I'm 60, not 61. I don't know whether the Prime Minister's found time to visit Hillingdon Hospital during the recent by-elections, where their wards have had to close, staff are working in appalling conditions, and patient safety is at risk. And that's simply a snapshot of the wider problem. This week, the National Audit Office set out in detail what everyone already knows. The government's hospital programme has, shall we say, some gaps in it. So can the Prime Minister confirm that, apart from the fact that there aren't 40 of them, and the fact that most of them aren't new, and that many of them aren't even hospitals, everything's going fine with the 40 new hospitals?
Mr. Speaker, not only are we going to deliver on our manifesto commitment to build 40 new hospitals across the country by 2030, we're not just stopping there, Mr. Speaker, because we're also delivering 100 hospital upgrades across the country and, crucially, over 100 new community diagnostic centres to speed up treatment for people, including, Mr. Speaker, in the Deputy Leader's constituency, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary's constituency, the Energy Secretary, the Justice Secretary, the Attorney General's constituency. That's how committed we are, Mr. Speaker. But look, let me end on this, because he mentioned Hillingdon Hospital, he mentioned Uxbridge. I tell you what, I want to help the people of this country, Mr. Speaker. I want to make sure that not only can they get to work, but they get the care they need. Why on earth does he want to charge them £12.50 every time they visit their GP and hospital?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was welcome news this morning of inflation falling by higher than expected. The businesses in my constituency are trying to plan their pricing for next January and are struggling because of the proposals to introduce the extended producer responsibility, and they don't yet have the information on how much it will cost or how it will work. So would the Prime Minister look at pausing and resetting that programme? So what we don't see in January is price rises in our supermarkets without the consequent reduction in packaging and increase in recycling that we all want to see.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for the question. This is something that has been raised with me by those in the industry. Now, we are committed to protecting the environment and delivering on our net zero targets, but DEFRA are continuing to engage closely with manufacturers, retailers and packaging companies on the precise design of the scheme, and I know that ministers will continue to keep this House and my honourable friend updated.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, the two-child benefit cap, as introduced by the Conservative Party, has left 250,000 children living in poverty. So can I ask the Prime Minister, does he take comfort in knowing that the heinous legacy of that policy will no longer just be protected by Conservative members, but by Labour members too?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Labour leader's newfound support for our policy, even though he previously committed to a different approach. But what I would say to the honourable gentleman, and indeed the Labour front bench, is that they don't have to worry too much, because given the Labour leader's track record, he's never actually kept a promise that he's made.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, voters in Scotland are used to child poverty under the Tories. They almost expect it. But what they don't expect is child poverty support from the Labour Party. And if we look very closely right now, there is a shiver running along the Labour front bench looking for a spine. Now, Mr. Speaker, does this not tell us something much bigger? That for children living in poverty in Scotland, Westminster offers them no real change. It offers them no real hope.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the best route out of poverty is through work, Mr. Speaker, and the best way to ensure that children do not grow up in poverty is to ensure that they do not grow up in a workless household. That's why we have focused on creating more jobs, with 200,000 more in Scotland since 2010, and hundreds of thousands fewer children across the United Kingdom growing up in a workless household. We will always continue to reduce child poverty. I don't want to see a single child grow up in poverty, and we will deliver that in every part of the UK, including in Scotland.
Shalish Vara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that if members opposite are in favour of illegal economic migration, then they should have the courage to say so, rather than claiming that young men in their 20s and 30s arriving here from safe countries are actually asylum seekers.
My honourable friend is right that the party opposite don't have a plan to tackle illegal migration, and we saw that just in this last week, Mr. Speaker, that they voted, I think, over 70 different times against our Stop the Boats bill. And that bill will make it crystal clear that if you come here illegally, you will be detained and swiftly removed to a safe third country. That is the fair, compassionate and right way to deal with this problem, and that's what we believe in.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's exactly a year to the day since UK temperatures hit a deadly 40 degrees for the first time, with 3,000 excess deaths last summer. Yet the Prime Minister's own climate advisers and businesses have said that his climate progress is worryingly slow. Now, he likes to claim that the UK is decarbonising more quickly than the rest of the G7, but since the Paris Agreement, that is simply not true. He likes to claim that it's not a top concern for the public, while recent polling shows that that's not true either. Experts, businesses and the public all want bolder climate action, but it isn't even one of his top 5 priorities. Can he tell us why not?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady just makes a completely bizarre point. Because we moved quicker and faster than everyone else, she thinks that somehow is something that we should now not be proud of. It's right that other countries are catching up. It's inevitable that they will have to decarbonise faster now to make up for the fact that over the past 2 decades they haven't followed our example. So I'm not going to take any lectures for her on this topic, because our track record is a good one, Mr. Speaker. We have decarbonised faster than everyone else, and right now we are making the right long-term decisions to make sure that we do transition to net zero, but do so in a way that brings people along with us and creates jobs in the process.
Bedfordshire businesses now have apprentices on the factory floor earning £48,000 a year on qualification, easily beating cost of living pressures. So what more can we do to get schools to promote apprenticeships to pupils and parents, as our colleges and institutes of technology are great poverty-busting institutions?
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. One of the practical steps that we are taking is to put all apprenticeships onto the UCAS system this autumn, which will make sure that they have parity of esteem in the classroom, increase information for parents and teachers. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, as I announced earlier this week, we are clamping down on university courses that fail to deliver good outcomes. Because what we should be doing is providing young people with the best opportunities for them to get on in life, and he's absolutely right that that should include apprentices.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why does the Prime Minister think that Sir Brian Langstaff, who chairs the public inquiry into infected blood, has reopened the hearings and has summoned before him the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Leader of the House and the Paymaster General to answer questions next week?
Mr. Speaker, my thoughts remain with all those affected by this appalling tragedy. The infected blood scandal should never have happened, and that's why the public inquiry was set up by one of my predecessors. I've submitted written evidence to the inquiry and am due to give oral evidence shortly, so it would be inappropriate for me to comment further at this time.
Greg Clark.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker. 800,000 people work indirectly or directly in our car industry, which accounts for 10% of our country's exports. So I strongly welcome the £4 billion investment by Tata in a battery factory, with the jobs associated with it. So will my right honourable friend build on that success and pursue a clear plan to get more gigafactories, including in the West Midlands, so we can capitalise on our lead in battery innovation and technology?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the importance of today's announcement, one of the largest ever investments in the UK auto industry in this country's history. Billions of pounds, thousands of jobs, and it is a massive vote of confidence in the UK economy.
What's a Philippa Whitford?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The NHS in England has just had its longest ever junior doctor strike, and consultants go on strike tomorrow for the first time in 50 years. Yet so far Scotland has had no NHS strikes. This isn't by chance, but because our Health Secretary and First Minister have kept working with the BMA to try and address the pay erosion faced by doctors since 2008. Workforce shortages are the biggest challenge facing healthcare, and the Prime Minister just mentioned the importance of staff retention. So does he really think refusing to even talk to health unions will stop doctors leaving the NHS?
Mr. Speaker, we did talk to health unions, but we also respected the independent pay review body process, Mr. Speaker, which is the right way to resolve these issues, and it means a typical junior doctor will see a 9% pay rise as a result of that deal, Mr. Speaker, combined with, as you mentioned, retention. Earlier this year, the government delivered the #1 ask of the BMA, which was to remove the cap on pensions tax that was specifically designed to retain senior doctors in the NHS. So the government has now done its bit, and I would urge the unions to please get back to the hospitals and treat your patients.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend share my unease that a bank that has the government as its largest shareholder should close the account of a senior opposition politician? Will he use the government's shareholding to ensure that there is an inquiry into these circumstances, because the subject data access request makes it clear, or certainly indicates, that it is the person concerned's political views that led to his cancellation? And does my right honourable friend agree with me that however much we may find them tiresome, members of the opposition deserve bank accounts?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't be right if financial services were being denied to anyone exercising their right to lawful free speech. Our new Financial Services and Markets Act puts in place new measures to ensure that politically exposed persons are being treated in an appropriate and proportionate manner. And having consulted on the payment services regulations, we are in the process of cracking down on this practice by tightening the rules around account closures. But in the meantime, any individual can complain to the Financial Ombudsman Service, which has the power to direct a bank to reopen their account.
That's sure.
Thank you very much. I know how it feels to be homeless, squatting from one place to another with your entire belongings in one single bin liner. Hard-working families, including Bradford West, are at risk of homelessness because of a Tory mortgage bombshell and failing to legislate to protect renters. So can I ask the Prime Minister, apart from totally losing a grip on the whole situation, what is he doing to stop 500,000 people from becoming homeless?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, actually rough sleeping levels are about a third lower in 2022 compared to the peak in 2017. And since our landmark Homelessness Reduction Act came into force, over 600,000 households have successfully had their homelessness prevented or relieved, and we are investing £2 billion over the next 3 years to continue to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister mentioned our armed forces. Can I mention them again? We lost 457 personnel in Afghanistan killed, and several thousand who suffered life-changing injuries. So I and some of my colleagues on the Defence Committee were absolutely stunned to see a video posted by our own chairman lauding the Taliban's governance of Afghanistan, not mentioning they're still trying to identify and kill Afghan civilians who sided with NATO forces, and also not mentioning the fact they don't like girls to go to school. So can I make plain this was not in our name, and can I have the Prime Minister's assurance that this silly and naive act was not in his name either?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I join with my honourable friend in paying tribute to our brave serving personnel and veterans and thank them for their service, as indeed we've touched on earlier today. And we have repeatedly and will continue to repeatedly call out the human rights abuses that we see around the world, and he mentions rightly the prohibition on women being educated in Afghanistan, which is something we've spoken about in the past. But we will also continue to have dialogue with regimes. That doesn't mean that we consider those regimes to be legitimate or approve of their actions, but that is all part, as he will understand, of establishing normal diplomatic presence in countries when the situation allows. But I'll very happily look into the specific case that he brought up with me.
Mr. Speaker, it's not just the adoption of the disgusting and heinous two-child benefit cap. It's the endorsement of a hard Brexit, the tuition fees, the immigration. Doesn't he agree that there's no real difference now between the two UK main parties? And isn't it time that we perhaps rearrange the furniture in this House and have them all on one big bench and perhaps retitle them that this is what you get from the UK party?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the question. I will leave him and the Labour Party to debate the finer policies between them. But I would say on the substance, because it is important that actually the track record demonstrates that we are making a difference in reducing child poverty, Mr. Speaker. There are now 400,000 fewer children in poverty than there were in 2010 as a result of the actions of this government, noticeably moving their parents into work, because it has the single best benefit for those children. That is the right policy, and it's one that we will continue to deliver.
Let's shake hands.
Therapy is quackery packaged up by bigots seeking to promote their hate and profit from it. On the 19th of January, the Minister at the Dispatch Box promised to bring forward a ban against conversion therapy and ensure that pre-legislative scrutiny was completed before the end of this parliamentary term. How does my right honourable friend plan to continue with that? But can I also welcome very much his statement from the floor today and thank those LGBT veterans who are here with us. We are so grateful for your service, and we do this ban also in your name.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for her question? And I agree with her that conversion therapy is an abhorrent practice, and we need to do everything we can to stamp it out wherever we see it. The Minister for Women and Equalities will continue to keep her and the House updated on our progress.
Barry Sharman.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Does the Prime Minister remember 7 years ago when he was a passionate supporter of leaving the European Union, along with his then best friend Boris Johnson? Is he aware that Sir John Major now says in every speech he makes that that decision was catastrophic for the people of this country and standards of living, and also deeply damaging to our role, status and influence in the world?
Mr. Speaker, I would say gently to the honourable member that at the beginning of his question, you think he made the central point. It was 7 years ago, Mr. Speaker, and we need to move forward. I would just gently point out to him, he talked about what's happened since then, that since we left the single market, this economy has grown faster than Germany, France and Italy, Mr. Speaker. And he talks about our standing on the world stage. Well, he wasn't here for our statement on the NATO summit last week, but nobody can be in any doubt that the United Kingdom is highly respected on the world stage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now then, just last week, the Leader of the Opposition announced his new flagship policy, the two-child benefit cap. It goes down very popular on this side of the House, but not so popular on that side of the House. But, Prime Minister, could you please tell the House, when will the Leader of the Opposition jump off the bandwagon and be honest with the British public and tell them what he stands for?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right. Now, it would be one thing, and I say I welcome the Leader of the Opposition now supporting the government's policy, but I don't think anyone actually believes that he believes in what he's saying. And I think that is the...
Just say, you don't need to worry, you've no responsibility for the opposition. Neil Coyle.
Mr. Speaker, every single member of this House is required by law to confirm the true source of a donation before it is accepted or declared. So can the Prime Minister tell us if he followed all the rules all the time before he took £38,500 of free air travel on the 28th of April, And if so, why does his story keep changing about who paid?
Mr. Speaker, all donations are declared in the normal way, and as the honourable gentleman knows, if there are administrative changes to that, those are quickly corrected.
David Davis.
The Prime Minister, back to the question raised quite rightly by my right honourable friend, the member for North East Somerset. The opposition politician he was referring to, of course, was Nigel Farage, whose bank account was closed, not because he was a PEP, not because of commercial reasons, but because his views did not align with the values of Coutts Bank, a thinly veiled political discrimination, a vindictive, irresponsible and undemocratic action. But in addition, NatWest also disclosed confidential details about Farage's account to the BBC and lied about the commercial viability of his account, actions which ought to jeopardise his banking licence and should certainly worry NatWest's 19 million other customers. So he's told us what he's going to do for the future, but there are many other people in this circumstance. So can he require every bank with a British banking licence to inform the Treasury of all the accounts they've shut down for non-commercial reasons the last decade?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that the honourable gentleman has spoken to the Chancellor about this particular issue, and I know he'll continue to have those conversations. In the short term, having consulted on the payment service regulations, we do intend to crack down on this practice by toughening the rules around account closures. But in the meantime, the Financial Ombudsman Service is available for people to make complaints to, but I look forward to continuing the dialogue with him, as indeed does the Chancellor.
Final question, Conor Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a father, the Prime Minister will know how precious children are. Adam Watson, aged 9, and Poppy Ogle, aged 10, from my constituency, sadly lost their battle with childhood cancer just last year. Their homes are forever broken. Both families want to see a change in financial support for the 1,600 children diagnosed with cancer across the UK each year. Would the Prime Minister commit to meet with these families, to listen to their stories and to review child DLA payments to commence immediately on diagnosis of childhood cancer, whether that be a terminal diagnosis or not? The 3-month wait for support is just too long. Surely this government can see fit to wrap its arms around these children and their families in their hour of need.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable lady for raising this issue. I can't imagine how difficult it is for families whose children are being treated for cancer and everything that will come along with that. I will happily look into the specific issue that she mentioned and get back to her in all haste, and she should know that she has my total support for helping and supporting families who are going through what will be an unbelievably difficult time.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. We now come to the urgent question. I call Holly Lynch.
Mr. Speaker, to ask the Home Secretary to make a statement on the contest update.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the government published an update to our counter-terrorism strategy contest. A WMS was laid together with the command paper in Parliament. Mr. Speaker, contest has a clear mission to reduce the risk from terrorism to the United Kingdom, our citizens and our interests overseas, so that people can go about their lives freely and with confidence. The terrorism threat level, set independently by JTAC, has not changed, but the threat from terrorism is enduring and evolving. Despite a prevalence of lower sophistication attacks in the UK, The threat we see today and in the coming years is more diverse, dynamic and complex. A domestic terrorist threat which is less predictable, harder to detect and harder to investigate. A persistent and evolving threat from Islamist terrorist groups overseas. And an operating environment where accelerating advances in technology provide both opportunity and risk to our counter-terrorism efforts. It's within this context that we judge that the risk from terrorism is once again rising. By far, the biggest terrorist threat comes from Islamist terrorism. It accounts for 67% of attacks since 2018 and about 3/4 of MI5's caseload. The remainder of the UK terrorist threat is largely driven by extreme right-wing terrorism, which amounts to approximately 22% of attacks since 2018 and about 1/4 of the MI5 caseload. Our counter-terrorism response will be even more agile in the face of an evolving threat, more integrated so that we can bring the right interventions to bear at the right time to reduce risk, and more aligned with our international allies to ensure that we continue to deliver together against this common threat. Through this updated strategy, we will place greater focus on using all the levers of the state to identify and intervene against terrorists. We will build critical partnerships with the private sector and international allies to keep the public safe. And we will harness the opportunities presented by new technology. Mr. Speaker, there is no greater duty for this government than to keep the British people safe, and I will not rest in delivering that mission.
The contest update has very much been a sobering reminder of the threats we face. Our agencies, to whom we are so grateful, have prevented 39 late-stage terror attacks in the last 6 years. The majority of them, as we have just heard, Islamist motivated, with extreme right-wing terrorism making up the remainder. However, we are concerned by certain omissions from the update and the disparity between the threats outlined and the responses proposed. On AI, the update recognises the challenge, saying terrorists are likely to exploit the technology. We have called for new offences criminalising the training of chatbots to radicalise individuals, but concrete measures are woefully lacking in the update, so how is the government going to tackle this? The update says that the threat from Daesh and IQ is on an upward trajectory. So can the Home Secretary now tell us how we're working urgently with international partners to mitigate that risk? The desperate situation in prisons is laid bare, with 4 of the 9 terrorist attacks in the UK since 2018 perpetrated by serving or recently released prisoners. We are told individuals may develop a terrorist mindset during their time in prison. So not only are we failing to de-radicalise people in prison, but people are being radicalised in prison, and failures to manage those prisoners upon release is putting the public at risk. So can the Home Secretary tell the House how many terrorist prisoners are due to be released in the next 12 months, and has every one of them been engaged in intensive de-radicalisation programmes, and have they been assessed for TPIMs? And finally, perhaps the most glaring omission is on state threats. This is despite the fact that the Director General of MI5 made clear in his annual threat update in November that Iran is the state actor which most frequently crosses into terrorism. In February, our agencies said that they had to disrupt 15 attempted kidnap and assassination attempts here in the UK. Remarkably, the report makes no reference to the resources, the approach or the powers necessary to respond to this form of terrorism. The Home Secretary knows that we have advocated for prescription powers on multiple occasions. So why does the government continue to reject these proposals, and why have they not finally prescribed the IRGC?
Home Secretary.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments. I know that she recognises the gravity and the sensitivity of this subject, and she will share my view that we must face the threat of terrorism united as a one and unified country. Since March 2017, our agencies and law enforcement have disrupted 39 late-stage terrorist plots in the UK, as she refers to. These have included the targeting of public figures, such as members of Parliament, specific communities and events, such as Pride, and public locations such as iconic sites in London. I want to put on record my profound thanks and admiration to all of the professionals who work day in, day out, under pressure, for all they do to keep the British people safe every day. Many of us will never know the lengths to which they go, applying their expertise, dedication, and public service attitude to put our safety above their own. I'm very proud of this government's track record when it comes to keeping the country safe. As Martin's Law makes its way through Parliament, I expect the opposition to be responsible and support us in our efforts to provide this extra layer of protection for venues. We've seen significant reforms in our National Security Act, now enacted. She mentioned terrorism in prisons. Well, we take a very tough approach to managing terrorist prisoners, limiting their interactions with each other and restricting their communications. And we've developed a new counter-terrorism assessment and rehabilitation centre for expert psychologists and specialist staff to research and implement specialist programmes to draw offenders away from terrorism. And indeed, the independent review of Prevent made extensive reference to recommendations related to those in custody. She also referenced the use of artificial intelligence and technology. Well, it's clear, Mr. Speaker, that foundation model AIs undoubtedly hold vast potential, and they are crucial to the UK's mission to become a science and tech superpower. But there are still many unknowns with this class of technology and many other forms of emerging technology which pose significant but not yet fully understood public safety and national security risks. I'm particularly concerned about the rapid development and public deployment of generative large language models like ChatGPT, and we are alert to the exponential pace of their development, the emergent capabilities which make the exact risks difficult to anticipate or control, and the relative ease with which safeguards can be overwritten. So those at the forefront of those technologies are explicit about their seriousness and of these risks if proper safeguards are not developed quickly. So we look forward to promoting and enabling an open and constructive dialogue and deepened collaboration with tech company leaders, industry experts and like-minded nations as we seek to ensure the gifts of this technology are delivered and society is protected. Indeed, the recent Five Eyes security meeting held in New Zealand, where I represented the UK, we discussed the emerging hostile use of technology and collaborative ways in which at the international level we may work to mitigate those risks. But, Mr. Speaker, to conclude, I'm very clear that we need to face the threats united as one country. I hope the opposition benches understand the heavy weight of that responsibility and that we work together constructively to keep the British people safe.
Phil.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the most effective ways to disrupt, identify and reduce the terrorist threat is to bring together the disparate and disjointed data sources which exist linking OCG activity to terrorists. Could my right honourable friend detail how the contest strategy will help make that happen?
Well, there is a huge, as I mentioned in my statement yesterday, there's a huge interaction and blurring of lines, if you like, between terrorist organisations and groups, hostile state actors and serious organised crime groups acting on a transnational basis to sophisticated and well-resourced networks and acquiring a heightened level of elusiveness. That is exactly why our contest strategy and refresh to it has been refreshed to realign our priorities, our resources, our technological capabilities and our coordination across agencies to properly respond in a swift and robust way to these emerging threats.
SNP spokesperson Stuart Sunak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start also by expressing my party's deep gratitude to all those working to protect us from despicable terrorist attacks. And of course our thoughts remain with all those who have suffered as a result of such evil crimes. And on that note, while welcoming the focus in the strategy on victims, can I raise recent reports of survivors of terrorism who have been deeply upset by poor treatment from the Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme? And can I ask the Home Secretary what discussions she has had with colleagues about fixing those particular problems? The commitment in the strategy to engage across the tech sector is indeed welcome, but like the Shadow Minister, I was surprised by the very limited reference in the strategy to use of artificial intelligence for radicalisation and instruction. A Windsor Castle crossbow attacker, for example, is a perfect illustration of someone being radicalised in that way. So can she say, does she believe legislation is required in this area? What more concrete steps are being taken to address use of AI in that way? What extra funding is going to be in place to support this refreshed strategy, particularly given reports that later this year we'll see a significant number of convicted terrorists completing their sentences and therefore requiring the most careful of management? And finally, Mr Speaker, the strategy also recognises the critical importance of the closest partnership working with devolved governments and agencies which have responsibility for delivery of various aspects of contest. Can we have her assurances that that close working will continue?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his observations. And he talked about the support and compensation for victims of terrorism. And I know that more can be done, must be done, which is why the government is reviewing the support available to better address victims' needs. But we are determined and absolutely committed to ensuring that victims of terrorism get the full compensation to which they are entitled, in line with schemes administered by the Criminal Injuries and Compensation Authority. And those schemes do deliver for victims of terrorism. The truth is, no amount of compensation can ever make up for the ordeal suffered by victims of terror. And that is why it is right that survivors get all the support they need in whatever form that may be required through the publicly funded Seeker, which paid out more than £158 million to victims of violent crime last year alone.
Treason for this.
I welcome this update of the strategy, and it would be helpful if the Home Secretary could tell us whether it contains elements to get the big tech companies to do more to prevent terrorists from exploiting their platforms, as highlighted in the ISC report on extreme right-wing terrorism.
Home Secretary.
Well, the technological aspect of terrorism is very real, and there are more and more sophisticated tools that our enemies are using against us for hostile purposes. That is plain from an intelligence point of view. That's why Contests makes a deliberate point of addressing the technological features of this kind of work, and there is a huge amount of investment and operational capability which has been put towards mitigating and dealing with this threat, most notably in the form of CTOC, a new collaboration centre which I had the honour of visiting very recently.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Speaker, a few weeks ago I met Travis Frayne, who's the founder member of Survivors Against Terror, who explained how his life had been changed forever with the Westminster Bridge terrorist attack, and how he didn't get the support he needed in the aftermath. So this week we've heard a survey of 130 survivors from 11 major terrorist incidents found that more than two-thirds felt that the compensation scheme overseen by the Criminal Injuries and Compensation Authority was unfair and unreasonable. The Home Secretary talked about a review. This is unacceptable that these people are in this position at the moment. When will the review actually be published?
Home Secretary.
As I've mentioned, there are no words, there is no amount of money that can adequately reflect the pain and suffering experienced by victims of terrorism. And that's why it is absolutely right that we provide victims of terrorism with full compensation and the fullest support possible and available to ensure that they are enabled to move forward from these tragic events. As I said, we know that more must be done. That's why we're reviewing the support available. We need to better address victims' needs through the current schemes, and we need to ensure that they are properly meeting the needs of victims.
Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are people in Ukraine who found their territory illegally occupied and annexed by Russia. Their children disappeared into Russian custody and their land settled by ethnic Russians. Under international law, we recognise the right of these victims of the criminal actions of the Russian state to resist. How can we ensure that we don't end up characterising these legal actions by the victims in this conflict and in other conflicts legally precisely analogous around the world as terrorism?
Home Secretary.
Well, I'm very proud of the UK's track record of supporting Ukraine and the Ukrainians, both in Ukraine and abroad, through this devastating illegal conflict that Russia and Putin have waged upon them. It is right that we provide the military support. It is right that we took an extensive, we rolled out an extensive set of sanctions against Russia, and it's right that we continue in our international and diplomatic support for the Ukrainian.
Cavan Jones.
Can I add the Home Secretary's comments into our security services and thank them for the work they do? The ISC report last year into right-wing terrorism found that 30% of those disruptive plots were from right-wing terrorism. Our report also found that it was mainly young people and also as an aim to either join the armed forces or the police. We made recommendations on tightening up vetting, for example, of police officers and also on prescribing membership of right-wing organisations to be members of the armed forces. Could you just update the House what progress has been made on those two issues?
Secretary.
Well, he's absolutely right to make reference to the emerging threat posed by extreme right-wing terrorism. And both the Director General of MI5 has referenced this in his annual update as these ideologies which are emerging and increasing in activity. And the independent review of Prevent focused on work that can be better done. It is absolutely right that we take robust action, and that is why I'm already acting on the recommendations set out by Sir William Shawcross on upgrading and updating Prevent so that it better responds to the risk of extreme right-wing terrorism as well as the risk posed by Islamist terrorism.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In updating the UK's counter-terror strategy, what work are the security services doing with UK Border Force to identify those entering the United Kingdom, particularly by irregular means?
Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, because the terrorists and those who have malign intent for our nation will exploit all sorts of vulnerabilities, including at the border. That is obvious, and that's why Contest deals specifically with this issue and the upgrade. We need to further strengthen the UK border as a critical line of defence against terrorism, taking advantage of new immigration tools, detection, targeting and biometric capabilities to identify and block threats from entering the UK illegally in the first place.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a policy area that throws up some of the most difficult cases ever to be found. So I welcome the Home Secretary's determination to build political consensus and to ensure that we work with our strategic allies. Some of the most difficult cases around counter-terrorism involve UK citizens, especially children, who were trafficked by ISIS and are currently in north-east Syria. That's an area where we risk becoming an outlier because all our allies have repatriated their citizens. It risks causing friction between ourselves and our allies, and indeed we have our own responsibility to the fact that these are UK citizens who were trafficked. Is there anything in this strategy that is going to help to tackle these very difficult cases?
Home Secretary.
Well, he's right to refer to this very regrettable feature of modern-day counter-terrorism. As Contest makes reference in paragraph 26, in recent years there's been a small increase in the number of minors investigated and arrested by counter-terrorism police. The most adverse activity conducted by minors has occurred online. Over half of under-18s convicted of terrorism offences over the past 5 years were charged with non-violent offences, so things like the collection or dissemination of terrorist publications. But it's absolutely vital that we that we're cognizant of this emerging threat, that we have the right resources and services and professionalism in place to mitigate and intercept the threat at source and as soon as possible. But it's clear that wherever criminality has occurred, there will be a robust response from the appropriate agencies.
James Wilde. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Technology brings huge benefits, but it's also exploited by terrorists. So is my right honourable friend confident that this updated strategy will ensure that technology companies do far more to prevent their services being used by those who wish us harm and to cooperate with our security and law enforcement services, particularly given the approach that some have taken on encryption and child abuse imagery?
Secretary.
Well, he's spoken about an issue that is very close to my heart in terms of the online child sexual exploitation. That is something that is rising at an exponential and horrifying pace. About 32 million instances of online child sexual abuse were recorded by the Global Recording Centre last year alone. In this country, in the UK, we arrest 800 individuals a month involved in this heinous crime, and we safeguard about 1,200 children a month. It is horrifying. That's why we are taking steps to work constructively with the tech companies. But in terms of contest, I refer him to the extensive sections on page 21 onwards and other parts which talk about the technological aspect, how it's emerging, and our actions and our response. Notably, our world-leading counter-terrorism operations centre, newly established to bring together the right data, technology and expertise to investigate and disrupt these types of threats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome this statement, although much delayed, much awaited. One of the key things that's missing from this is the use of CHISs, the covert human intelligence sources. These are what known as people who used to be informants to the police. Increasing number of people caught under this network are people with mental health issues in terrorism. Would you provide a detailed account of how many CHISs are used and what is the results, and how many people suffering from mental health are reported by these people? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
Well, I can't get into details of which relate to operational independence and decisions made by the agencies in live investigations. But what I would say is that I expect all agencies and law enforcement organisations to use the full breadth of powers which we have afforded them.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The current situation whereby tens of thousands of young men are arriving in small boats on our shores, primarily young men from unstable parts of the world, is frankly an accident waiting to happen. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that the British people expect our borders to be robustly enforced, and this is just as important when it comes to defending our nation from terrorism as it is for anything else?
Home Secretary.
Well, a strong border is critical to counter terrorism, and the Contest 2023 strategy clearly sets that out. In fact, the Nationality and Borders Bill 2020 Act 2022, the government revised Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, expanding powers to prevent illegal entry, including via small boats. Now, our migration and border system provides a critical opportunity to identify and manage individuals and goods who pose a terrorist concern. That's why rigour and robustness in our borders is absolutely essential for national security.
Mr. Speaker, in the government's response to the ISC extreme right-wing terror report, and can I thank the Home Secretary for referring to the scale of that threat earlier in her remarks, the government said our counter-terrorism strategy contest remains threat agnostic, so that rather than targeting specific ideologies, our tools, powers and overall CT approach can adapt to changing threats, while also ensuring our approach is able to identify and assess what are inherently ideological threats. So can I simply ask her to confirm
There's nothing she's said today and nothing which has been published which changes the underlying philosophical basis of the way the contest strategy operates.
Secretary.
Well, as the contest strategy refresh makes clear, there are a broad range of ideologies and narratives which draw people into supporting terrorism. And that can range, as I said, from Islamist terrorism. That is by far the largest proportion of MI5's caseload. But there is also an increasing threat from extreme right-wing terrorism that we must confront, we must eliminate, and we must do everything in our power to stop. Wherever it comes from, however people are radicalised into extremist and violent behaviour, is unacceptable, and we take a robust approach ultimately to keeping the British people safe.
Tony on the outs.
Mr. Speaker, now in June this year the Borders Inspectorate said that not every arrival into the UK at Manston was having security checks done as part of their interview or having their property checked. Can she guarantee now that every arrival is being fully checked? And if not, Mr. Speaker, why not?
Secretary.
Well, having visited the reception centre at the Western Jetfoil and Manston, and having been working very closely on ensuring that the right facilities and resources and mechanisms are in place to ensure that those who arrive illegally are appropriately accommodated, we do ensure that those who arrive are checked. They go through biometric checks, they go through any other appropriate checks, and then they are put through our processing centre, generally at Manston, and then they are put on a track effectively to other onward accommodation if they have an asylum claim. That is the general scheme that we've been carrying out for some time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, UK police and security services used to conduct over 600 million real-time security checks on a shared EU platform before we lost access after Brexit. At the time, government informed us that we would have access to a shared platform within 2 or 3 years. But now the Permanent Secretary has advised that we will not have access to a shared data set until 2027 or 2028. So can the Home Secretary confirm just how much of a damaging effect is it having with the loss of this vital intelligence and security mechanism on our ability to tackle terrorism and cross-border crime?
Home Secretary.
I mean, I know he's on his, Brexit bandwagon or whatever it is, but the reality is, from a security point of view, we have never had stronger collaboration with international partners than today, and we have continued to develop our global reach and insight through sustained working with allies, particularly the Five Eyes, where we share an enormous amount of common approach and strategic development, but also with European partners. I've met with many of my European counterparts, and we share this common goal of combating national security. And in many instances, amongst European allies, the UK is seen as a leader and as a country and a nation which is valued for its contribution to pan-European national security.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Speaker, as my friend the Shadow Minister quite rightly states, the government's update acknowledges that when it comes to AI, terrorists are likely to exploit the technology to create and amplify radicalising content, propaganda and instruction materials, and to plan and commit attacks. Yet there are no concrete plans in this update to address these growing risks, and beyond pointing to the government's own delayed yet again online safety bill, which has been watered down, other than the rhetoric we have heard today from the Secretary of State, what is the government actually doing? What concrete plans are in place to tackle this growing problem? Because we've seen little to no action thus far.
She obviously hasn't read the document, because if she had, she would see our actions, our achievements, and what our plans are. So, first of all, I'll savour the trouble of reading the document, is that we are realising the full potential of our newly established world-leading Counter-Terrorism Operations Centre. Don't think she's visited. I recommend that she tries to visit because it's an incredibly impressive, as I say, world-leading operational centre established very recently, which brings together the right teams, data and technology to more effectively identify and interrupt and disrupt terrorists. We're also ensuring that there is a broader range of expertise from non-law enforcement interventions to mitigate the evolving terrorist threat. We are maintaining our investment in the critical threat assessment capabilities through the world-class Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, JTAC. I could go on, but in the interest of time, she probably will do better to read the document first.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new contest counter-terrorism strategy mentions that incel threats could, and I quote, meet the threshold of terrorist intent and action. The person behind the shooting in Plymouth in 2021, where we lost 5 people, could have had their actions informed by incel culture and violent misogyny. Incel violence currently falls out of the scope, largely, of all the prevent strategy tactics. So does the Home Secretary agree with me that it's now time to develop a cross-government incel strategy so we can not only prevent people going down that path towards violent misogyny, but also help rescue those people who are doing so, providing a greater level of community safety for not only women, but our entire community, and never again see the violence that we saw in Plymouth repeated on our streets?
Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is an incredibly powerful advocate for his constituents, and let me put on record my thoughts and prayers for the loved ones of all of those who were tragically lost or affected. Incel culture is not strictly within the contest apparatus, if you like, but it does need work. I readily accept that this is a violent trend, it is a radicalising influence, it is promoting a culture that is totally at odds with a free, safe and democratic society that we all love and want to cherish. I'm very happy to speak to him about what further steps we could do and take as a government.
Stephen Farray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In March of this year, the security threat level in Northern Ireland was increased from substantial to severe in the aftermath of the attempted murder of DCI John Caldwell. Since 2016, the additional security funding that this government provides to the police service of Northern Ireland has been flatlined in cash terms at £32 million each year. So can the Home Secretary undertake to review the level of that funding to ensure that the PSNI and also the security service have the tools to continue their good work in combating both dissident Republican and loyalist terrorism?
Home Secretary.
Well, Northern Ireland-related terrorism does remain a serious threat, particularly in Northern Ireland, and the contest strategy doesn't actually address the threat from Northern Ireland in Northern Ireland. That is managed by a separate strategic approach, namely led by the Northern Ireland office. But at the Home Office, and our contest approach does cover the threat from Northern Ireland-related terrorism in mainland Great Britain. So it is important that we don't decouple those two threats. They are very interlinked, and there is we know that some dissident Republican groups continue to carry out terrorist attacks, as he's referred to. So we need to ensure that all the resources are available, and we want to ensure that we support partners in Northern Ireland so that they are readily equipped to mitigate and respond to this threat.
Martin Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In June, the National Security Advisor to the Canadian Government, a key Five Eyes member, listed Russia, China, Iran as key state actors which pose a threat to Canadian life. They then added India to that list due to the rise of Hindu nationalist activity targeting specifically Canadian Sikhs. I wonder if that's anywhere in terms of the Home Secretary's thinking around extremism, and if not, why not?
Home Secretary.
Well, as I said, there are the general ideologies are set out in our prevent approach, in our contest approach, and we are actor agnostic, but we note where these threats are emerging based on a casework analysis as confirmed by MI5 and other agencies. The predominant threats relate to Islamist terrorism, but of course it is right that robust law enforcement responses meet any kind of violence, any kind of extremism that falls into meets the criminal threshold.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome very much the Secretary of State's answers to the questions that have been posed today. Further to the question of the Honourable Member for North Down, and to follow on from that, will the Secretary of State outline what steps have been taken to allocate the additional funding to local police forces in areas with higher threat levels, such as Northern Ireland, where Republican terrorism is a real threat to the democratic process? Bearing in mind that the police budget in Northern Ireland has been cut in real terms in a time of crisis, can the Secretary of State confirm what discussions have taken place with the Chief Constable and the Policing Board to ensure that the commitment to ring-fencing funding for the battle against terrorism in all of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is maintained? Thank you.
Secretary.
Well, I made some reference to the specific nature of the threat posed by Northern Ireland-related terrorism. It's primarily concentrated and directed against targets in Northern Ireland. That is clear. I regularly discuss with colleagues in the UK government and on how we can ensure robust defences across the whole piece. But I'm very happy to see what more can be done through a conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The rapid proliferation of end-to-end encryption and anonymous messaging services allows terrorist groups to communicate freely without the risk of detection or identification. Personal privacy must, of course, be upheld for ordinary citizens. So how is the government looking to work with tech experts to find alternative ways of accessing the communications of members of such groups?
This is something that really does concern me, and the proposed rollout of end-to-end encryption without enabling lawful access or without safeguards will pose a danger, not just to national security, but also to children, to our people. It is absolutely vital that the technology companies work with us to roll out the available technology that I am confident does exist to enable and protect privacy rights, but also at the same time to enable law enforcement access and interventions to take place so that we can safeguard children online, we can prevent radicalisation online, and we can prevent criminality online.
That completes the urgent question. Just let the front bench change over. We now come to the independent review into the impact of the historic ban on LGBT military personnel had on veterans. I call the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I would like to expand on the apology delivered by the Prime Minister this afternoon for the unacceptable hurt caused to the LGBT members of our nation's armed forces by the 1967 to 2000 ban on homosexuality. It was not acceptable. It was not what the brave men and women it affected deserved, and for that, on behalf of the government and the armed forces, I am deeply sorry. Mr. Speaker, for hundreds of years, joining the British Armed Forces has been a career choice full of opportunity, adventure and self-improvement. One of the most fulfilling and stimulating occupations a young person can choose, but it is also a self-sacrifice and bravery. This morning we have published the independent review into the service and experience of LGBT veterans who served prior to 2000. It makes for miserable and distressing reading, and it is only right that this House takes the time to acknowledge and reflect on those veterans who have shared their experiences with the review. Mr. Speaker, I myself, along with a number of colleagues in this House, served in our armed forces at the time of the ban was in place. I cannot imagine what it must have been like to join the armed forces, buoyed up by the great spirit of service, and only to discover to your horror that many believe you didn't fit. I cannot imagine what it must have felt like to have been hounded out of a job you loved simply on account of your sexuality. Nor can I imagine what it must have been like to lose your livelihood, your family, your home, simply because of the person you choose to love. Yet this was the experience of many sailors, soldiers and aviators over decades. and it happened here in this country little over 20 years ago. The report published today brings this experience to life for us and spotlights the hurt felt by those affected, and for that I am truly grateful. The ban was introduced in 1967, unbelievably after the Sexual Offences Act had decriminalised same-sex sexual acts in private between consenting adults. To add to the injustice, when the ban ended at the beginning of the millennium, the stories of those who suffered were forgotten and their records buried. Additionally, in 2010 and 11, in line with government policy agreed by the Association of Chief Police Officers, the MOD enacted a policy to destroy legacy police investigation records concerning decriminalised sexual offences, so that historical decriminalised convictions could not show up on criminal record checks of service personnel. I want to assure veterans that this was not a cover-up and does not mean that their wider service records have been destroyed. Mr. Speaker, I want to place on record my thanks and gratitude to Lord Etherton and his team for compiling this comprehensive report. It was commissioned in January 2022, and since 1,128 people have responded with their experiences, many in substantial detail. I want to pay particular tribute to all those who came forward. They have shown tremendous courage in chronicling traumatic experience, which for many has been causing grief and groundless shame for decades. I also want to place on record my admiration and thanks to Fighting with Pride, especially Craig and Caroline, who for so long have held the baton. The testimonies make truly harrowing reading. They paint a shocking and shameful picture of a defence that is hard to comprehend. The enforcement of the ban became something of a witch hunt. The testimonies details investigations, invasive searches and examinations, degrading tests, brutal bullying, and in some cases sexual abuse. One doctor who joined in 1984 describes how he had to perform a test for which there was no medical clinical basis. Some who thought they could confine in their chaplains were stunned to find their details were passed to their superiors. For those affected, their hardships impacted on every aspect of their lives. Reputations were demeaned and defamed. Commissions were surrendered and officers demoted by multiple ranks. Veterans who served with distinction, awarded medals in famous campaigns from the Falklands to the Gulf, were stripped of their medals. Mr. Speaker, we cannot turn back the clock, but we can make amends and take action. This report makes 49 recommendations. My department, alongside the Office of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Health and Social Care, and others across government in partnership with the devolved administrations and the charity sector, all have a role in delivering this report's recommendations. I know that many in the LGBT veteran community have been eagerly awaiting the publication of this report, and rightly so. They have been waiting for decades to be heard. But I'm pleased to say that since we received this report at the end of May, the Government has been busy working through the recommendations across multiple departments to ensure that we can come to the House today accepting in principle the vast majority of the report's recommendations. And whilst we agree with the intent behind them, there are a number we may deliver in different ways to the described in the report. We will set out these differences when we publish the Government's full response to the review after the summer recess. But I can assure this House that will be the time that we can not only deliver restitution and redress to the LGBT veteran community, but it will also be a time where we can make sure this House properly debates not only the report, but also the Government's response to it and its recommendations. This, Mr. Speaker, of course, is a statement today, and while I welcome all colleagues' challenge and requests on it, I decided specifically that the debate for the House should come to also give the chance to debate the Government's recommendations. I think that is the right thing to do, and while that may take the summer, I think that is just important that both the opposition and ourselves and our colleagues can hold me to account or my successor. In fact, already we have, however, delivered 6 of the recommendations today, and we heard the first recommendation of all was delivered by the Prime Minister this morning at the dispatch box. And importantly, we also set up a digital front door, which has gone live today at midday, to offer information on veteran services, support and restorative measures to those affected by the ban. I would encourage the LGBT veterans to visit it, to see what support is available to them now, and to stay informed as to delivery of these recommendations as they are rolled out. I'm happy to be drawn on further details and recommendations during today's questions, but as I said, I would think the House should have the proper time to debate and scrutinise those. I'm glad that today's MOD is a very different place today from the defence in the late 60s to 90s. Our LGBT colleagues are an integral and undifferentiated part of the defence family, making a fantastic difference all over the world. At the start of this month, our Minister for Defence Personnel and Veterans met LGBT members of our armed forces and veterans before they marched to London Pride. It is an occasion that has become a celebrated part of our military calendar. Today's MOD policies are geared towards LGBT issues. There is training for LGBT allies and thriving LGBT staff networks. There is no place for prejudice in the modern armed forces, though of course things are by no means perfect, which is why we continue to improve on our zero-tolerance policies towards discrimination. However, we should not forget that we could not have reached this point were it not for some incredibly brave people. I would like to pay tribute to those who have campaigned for justice over the decades, as I said, fighting with pride, rank outsiders and the Armed Forces Legal Action Group. Cultural change takes time, particularly in large organisations like our armed forces, but it can only really begin when individuals are prepared to stand up and be counted. Mr. Speaker, this government has shown it cares about righting historical wrongs. It is why we brought forward this review, and once we have taken the time needed to fully work out how we'll deliver recompense to this community, we look forward to the government being back at the dispatch box to outline those details later. In his preface report, Lord Etherton notes survivors have waited for at least 23 years for acknowledgement of what they have suffered and for justice and restitution. So today is about that acknowledgement. It is about recognising the saddening personal accounts and the deep traumatic hurt that the historic ban has caused. It is about acknowledging the adversity they overcame. It is about celebrating the spirit of service they displayed, and it is about taking the time to acknowledge their importance within our defence family, serving or veteran. I was struck by one particular quote in the report from a veteran who said, "I don't feel like I'm a veteran. I've never asked for help. I don't feel like my service was recognised." Today we want to say to all those ex-soldiers, sailors and aviators, many now in retirement, you are one of us. You belong in our community, and in choosing to put yourself in harm's way for the good of your colleagues, your community and your country, you have proven yourselves the best of us. I say again to the veterans community, I'm deeply sorry for what happened to you. The very tolerance and values of Western democracy that we expected you to fight for, we denied to you. It was profoundly wrong. I'm determined as Defence Secretary and as a veteran to do all I can do today to right those historic wrongs so that you can once again take pride in your service and inspire future generations to follow in your footsteps.
Shadow Minister Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Minister for the advanced sight of his statement. Today might be his last appearance at the dispatch box, so I want to pay tribute to him for focusing his last appearance on such an important issue for the LGBT+ community. I want to begin my response by thanking Lord Etherton and his team for their diligent work in completing this review into the pre-2000 ban on LGBT+ serving personnel in the UK Armed Forces. And as the Leader of the Opposition said at PMQs, we strongly welcome the apology from the Prime Minister as a recognition of this historic injustice. The review represents very important progress in recognising the injustice LGBT+ veterans have suffered and recommends a framework to enable LGBT+ veterans to rebuild their lives and get the resolution they need. On behalf of the Labour Party, I pay tribute to LGBT+ veterans and groups like Fighting with Pride who have campaigned for justice over this appalling treatment. It was right for the government to have launched the review, reflecting proposals put forward by the Labour Party during the passage of the Armed Forces Act. The loss of livelihoods and long-term suffering endured by LGBT+ veterans due to the cruel and unjust ban has been enormous. LGBT+ veterans put their lives at risk to protect our country. They were our nation's heroes, yet suffered a serious injustice. As a consequence of the ban, we now know that around 20,000 LGBT+ military personnel were jailed, dismissed, outed to their families, or subject to abuse simply because of their sexuality or gender identity. This should have never happened. Many lost a job they loved, their income, pension and honours, and those dishonourably discharged were banned from wearing their military uniform at remembrance events. Many more were forced to conceal their true identity. The review also references the shocking and appalling treatment of serving LGBT+ personnel, including the disgraceful use of electric shock therapy. No one across the whole of society should be subjected to that awful practice. I've spoken to brave LGBT+ veterans impacted by the ban. They told me how they lost careers they loved, suffered disgraceful abuse, and still suffer the impact of the ban, all for simply being themselves. Many LGBT+ veterans showed exceptional courage to reach back into traumatic memories to contribute to the review. 1,128 people responded to the review, sharing their lived experiences, and it's important their testimonies are heard to ensure the LGBT+ community has a sense of ownership of the report. Today's commitments represent the beginning of the process. We must now see immediate action from the government to implement the review's recommendations, as it will begin the process of helping LGBT+ veterans get the resolution they need and in some cases rebuild their lives. The Secretary of State has said the government agrees with the intent behind the recommendations, but may deliver a number of them in a different way to described in the report. So will he outline to the House which recommendations will be delivered in a different way to that set out in the report? How has this been decided? And whether government will work with LGBT+ veterans and third sector groups to ensure they are delivered appropriately. We fully support giving back medals to LGBT+ veterans and ending the ban on those dishonourably discharged due to their sexuality or gender identity from wearing uniform at remembrance ceremonies. And I hope the Minister will outline how veterans can seek the return of their medals. Recommendation 28 states that an appropriate financial award should be made to affected veterans. How is the Defence Secretary and the Chancellor planning to take this forward? Any proposed compensation scheme must be accessible to all veterans affected, whether they were dishonourably discharged, medically discharged at the time because of their sexuality, or dismissed while under investigation. The recommendations relating to mental health and physical welfare must be delivered in an inclusive manner, recognising all LGBT+ veterans and the different ways they were affected by the ban and dismissed. So can the Minister assure the House and the LGBT+ community that this is an issue his department is actively considering? The government must do whatever it takes to successfully implement the recommendations, and we look forward to the government's full response and to the future debate. We cannot right the wrongs of the past, but we can help LGBT+ veterans now fix their lives damaged for too long by this ban.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for the opposition, and I think, like this side of the House, we all share the desire to not only honour those veterans and the apology that we all make, but also recognition that we have to work through to deliver recommendations that will make that difference. There's no delay for anything other. We're not avoiding the question. When I say we may apply them differently, there are simple areas around GDPR or also difference of opinions in the same community. I give an example, the veterans badge. There are some within the LGBT community who would say that they are veterans, full stop. They don't want to be differentiated. They want the same veterans badge as all other veterans. And there are others in that community who want a separate badge. Now, there's no easy answer to that, which is why we're going to be working very closely with people like Fighting with Pride to work our way through that. The same goes for the issues of financial provision or financial recognition of the harm done, making sure we do an elegant solution that matches the needs and the requirements of those individuals, rather than coming to this House in haste, making a statement, as we've seen in many of these former schemes, infected blood, etc., that sometimes, if they're not thought through, actually it causes more problems, and lawyers seem to take more money than the victims who deserve to be compensated or supported. And I'm just determined that we make sure we do that. We'll be very happy to work with the opposition through this process in advance of any debate to discuss with you what we're thinking on the recommendations. We have no qualms about this. This whole House has a role to play, I think, in valuing those veterans, people of my age group who served in that old army. And I say old army because the part of the report that talks about institutional homophobia is true. You read it. I was part of that army. I was determined to give this statement today rather than my excellent colleague, because I wanted to recognise that I had been part of that thinking and army that I deeply regret. And I think, therefore, we should get these recommendations right. but there are just some things that are not as straightforward to do. Where we've been able to get on with them, we have already done. The apology, the website that has gone live today on gov.uk about LGBT veterans and next steps, about helping restore medals. We have done that process, and also trying to help inform the former veterans communities, for example, that their pension rights were not abolished. Often as they left, they were misinformed or bullied and told all sorts of things, that their records would disappear completely, that they would have no pension. That is not true. There are some pensions still to be claimed, and we should do everything we can do to help them.
Let's go to the gallant gentleman, Crispin Blunt.
Mr. Speaker, I found a way of accommodating myself to the laws of the time and the rules of society of the time, and then overtly follow a successful journey through my life and career. This report, an outstanding piece of work, is causing me to re-evaluate the damage done to me, the price paid by those closest to me of making that accommodation. I am just profoundly grateful. I now live in a society and under laws that allow me to be myself. Will my right honourable friend ensure that all 49 recommendations are delivered to the intention and in the spirit with which the author of this report met?
Secretary of State. My right honourable friend is a good friend of mine, and I remember him doing that brave decision as he did at the time. And many of us on this side of the House who know him well and across the House pay tribute to his not only that moment when he decided to come out, but also the ongoing campaigning he has done for all of those people in society, not just LGBT, but across society, for people who have had to make, probably suppress difficult decisions in their life. What I can give them as an assurance is the spirit of that report, the recommendations. We will absolutely hold to the intention behind those recommendations. We will do everything we can to implement them, and only where they come across difficult technical challenges, we will seek another way to still fulfil the intention. But all of that will be done in a transparent manner. It won't be done behind closed doors. We'll make sure that when we have a problem, we discuss it. When there's a two sides to the argument type discussion, such as the Veterans Badge, we will consult with the community as close as possible. And also, if I ask that people recognise, in some of these recommendations, there will be no perfect answer. Some people within that community will have a different view. We have to find a way of accommodating that as well.
SNP spokesman Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope you'll indulge me for a moment, because I know that this may be the Secretary of State's last time at the dispatch box as Secretary of State. Let's see what the summer brings. But I have to say to him, as a former member of the Defence Select Committee, I found him hard-working, determined. We might not have always agreed on a few things, but when it came to issues that I found very important as a member of that committee, especially the High North and the North Atlantic, he answered the questions I think the committee always, and the way the committee always wanted to hear. And I commend him for his work and his role, and you never know, we might see him back in Holyrood, where it all started in the first place. So also let me thank him for sight of his statement as well, and also note it's quite appropriate that this last appearance possibly should be one where he rights, as he says, a historic wrong. And I also commend those who have played a part in bringing us to this point. And I do see Craig Jones and Caroline Page in the gallery, and I want to commend them and everyone who has worked so hard over so many years for the work that they have done. Madam Deputy Speaker, those of us on these benches also welcome the statement. Being a member of the gay community has never been a barrier to material accomplishment. From a little history lesson from Achilles to Frederick the Great, from James VI to even William III, we should be clear that LGBT people have served with distinction at every level of the armed forces for as long as humanity has existed. And I also appreciate the Secretary of State's candour about his own time in service. And I also appreciate the Secretary of State's clear use of the LGBT community, as it's a welcome indeed that his department has not sought to play a part in other other issues going on which are a distraction from the reality of the LGBT community. I'm indeed extremely grateful for that. So in doing so and acknowledging the work that's got us to where we are right now, can I ask the Secretary of State what work his department is doing not only to widen access for LGBT personnel, but what work has been done to push back against pernicious idea that LGBT inclusion is contrary to the interests of the armed forces and our national security. And whilst we may want to talk about medals, that's great, maybe hear something about pensions for the spouses of the dead who have not lived to see this point in time.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to my honourable colleague across the floor, and you may never know, you may find me back in the Scottish Parliament where it all began. Well, I'm not going to live till 200, so I don't know if there will be an independent one. But nevertheless, and I've always enjoyed working with him, Madam Deputy Speaker. No, I think he's absolutely right. There is no barrier to the success of gay men and women and what they can achieve in this world. Dr. Turing was probably the greatest war hero in my book of the Second World War. His achievements shortened the war, saved thousands of lives, helped defeat the Nazis, and his story is a sad story of a society and how it treated him. And I remember campaigning that he was on a £50 note or whatever note it was, and I think if I think what the plinth at Parliament Square should be full of, the blank plinth, instead of the mayor's gimmicks, whatever it is, every other 5 minutes, it should be Mr. Turing, Dr. Turing. That would be the greatest tribute to the success of someone from the LGBT community and what they have done in this world. I think when it comes to pensions, as I've said, pensions rights are still there for those veterans. For those who were not aware of that or who were ill-informed or deliberately misled, the website today will hopefully lead them to that, and with that will come the rights of their dependents, if not. And I will be very happy, as a backbencher in this House, to take up that cause and make sure that they have access to that as well. And I think, you know, we all see in the media, D&I is often knocked by the media and ridiculed, and efforts to try and accommodate all in our armed forces. Our armed forces is only as good as the society it reflects. We cannot afford not to have the talent of the LGBT community, just like we cannot afford to have the talent of women in the armed forces. It is simply ridiculous if we were to not encourage it, support it, and make sure it thrives.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, can I first of all warmly thank my right honourable friend and also the Shadow Minister for all they've had to say about this excellent report, and also my honourable friend Dr. Reigate, whose testimony moved us all. This report's a very fine report, and Lord Etherton has done a first-class job in bringing it forward. And I very much welcome the fact that the Prime Minister had a very real and very heartfelt apology, as did my right honourable friend at the beginning of his statement, over this historic outrage. However, would the House not agree with me that actually the real outrage has been the fact that there's been 22 years and nothing at all has happened? It's actually taken us 22 years as a nation, all parties, to put this thing right. And that is quite wrong. And therefore, I think that the sincerity of the Prime Minister's apology will be judged not only by how well he does in achieving the 47 recommendations in the report, but how enthusiastically and how quickly and how rapidly and how well he brings those things forward. The LGBT community are waiting to hear, waiting to see what they do. We will judge him, and we look forward to the debates in the autumn. We will judge him by the enthusiasm with which he adopts these recommendations.
Secretary of State.
I can't answer why 22 years took so long. All I can say is, from the authority I have in my office for now, being able to commission this report and start that process is something that I am proud and pleased to have done, ably supported by the Veterans Minister in the Office of Veterans Affairs and indeed my colleague, the Minister for Personnel and Veterans in the Department. I think it is, I can only speak for that. The enthusiasm, the support for getting this implemented, well, like you, I'll be sitting alongside him soon, and I can hold whoever comes to this dispatch box to account to do it. I absolutely think we should do it with enthusiasm. But the easiest thing I could have come today, and there was at one stage a thought about, should we just have a debate today, a full debate, would have to come here with no solutions. That would have been the worst thing to do to this House. The best thing is to come with a statement, come after the summer, hold the government to account for it. And I'll be there on your side holding the government to account for whether it or not it upholds those recommendations.
Stephen Doughty.
Deputy Speaker, and can I draw attention to my own interests, including my own past service as an openly gay Army reservist post the ban. And I too strongly welcome the apology today, but I'm acutely aware that I was only able to serve openly because of the repeal of the ban, and that I had a very different experience in service than so many here today, including honourable friend opposite. And I cannot praise enough the work of veterans who have campaigned so tenaciously, but also for their service and their courage, which they have exhibited so many times over, both during their service careers and post them. But when I wrote to the Ministry of Defence a few years ago on behalf of a lesbian constituent of mine who had been discharged for her sexuality, it's the first time she'd ever told this to anybody when she came to see me on my surgery, she told me that it was recorded in her record of service and in her discharge that her services were no longer required, when of course she was discharged for being a lesbian. And told me of the horrific experiences she'd gone through in the invasion of her privacy and the impact that had on her for decades. When I wrote to the MOD, I was told that her service record could not be amended because it had been administered correctly and that it would be inappropriate to do so. So could the Secretary of State tell me now whether, given the recommendations in this report, particularly R26 and 27, whether records will now be able to change to reflect truly the service and the bravery of so many of our veterans?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the honourable member, and you know, I'm grateful for your service. I think, if I think of my own experience, being friends with, getting to know men and women from the gay community, which I didn't really in my childhood and certainly in my service because it was never talked about, is what has brought me to a position where I do things like I regret voting against gay marriage. My relationship and friendship with people like the Honourable Member for Reigate and the former Member for Andor, and meeting friends and colleagues around the House, is part of the experience for all of us. But I also think, as you say, making sure that those veterans that want their service record to say what they want, to be open about it, we absolutely should see a way of how we can accommodate that. I think it is going to be not easy. It doesn't mean to say we can't do it, but there was a policy clearly running through the armed forces where the real records, the real reasons people were left, were not put on the record. I think that applies to tens of thousands or thousands of people. And of course, that is going to be a challenge, not an insurmountable challenge, but we must find a way through of how we can do that. And I am clear that we should do so. I also remember, however, the debate when I was, I think, a PPS in the Ministry of Justice, when there was debates around pardons. And there was then at that stage a longing for people's records to be removed because people didn't want on their record a criminal offence of an offence they felt should never have happened. And that was slightly the driving force between those police chiefs' discussions that led to the destruction of the records. It wasn't, as I said, a cover-up. There were some people who said this was a wrong, it shouldn't be on my record, why should I be known for that? And so we just have to find a way through. But anything we can do to try and do so, I will do my very best, and I know the defence team will as well.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Does the review report throw any light upon the strange paradox that this ban was so rigidly enforced in peacetime, and yet during both the First and Second World War there was mass conscription, as a result of which many gay military personnel served with distinction, and many were awarded the highest medals for gallantry?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty cruel reflection on a state. It wasn't just gay or LGBT people, it was women. First and Second World War, women kept the industry going. They kept, not the home fires burning, they kept the factories going. The women that weren't allowed to actually fly fighter planes in war, but were allowed to deliver them. It was, and then after the war, everyone went back to treating women, in some cases, as second-class citizens in the workplace. And I think it's absolutely a very good observation that we should never repeat. And I think hopefully embracing the fact we have great achievers serving now in our armed forces who are gay is the way to make sure we set the right example for the future.
Margaret Farrier.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Defence Secretary for his statement. 270 pages, 49 recommendations, a lot of summer reading. I welcome the government's apology to LGBT veterans today. These veterans served their country, but a number of them found themselves stripped of their medals. Will these now be returned swiftly? And the ban on LGBT veterans wearing their uniform at ceremonies be lifted?
Secretary of State.
In answer to both, yes. And then also there were some veterans who were told they didn't qualify for medals in the first place. They too will be able to have their medals from now on.
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I please thank the Defence Secretary for his statement, which, as a proud LGBTQ+ champion, I strongly support. Madam Deputy Speaker, I wonder please if you might indulge me the opportunity, as a former commanding officer, of presenting my right honourable friend with his annual appraisal on his final tour of duty with the MOD. It says here quite clearly, Captain Wallace is strident, forthright, spirited and fearless in the pursuit of an outcome, which of course we've just seen with the statement. While I have regrettably graded him A- for potential, given that he is moving on from the top job, we can all agree that he is an A+ for performance. Does he therefore agree with me that he leaves the MOD in a much better place than when he arrived, not least for LGBTQ+ personnel?
Secretary of State.
I'm very grateful to my friend. The truth be known, I don't think I ever got an A in anything, Madam Deputy Speaker, so maybe I finished this job without being found out. Thank you.
Kevin Jones.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I warmly welcome this report and pay tribute to the campaigners. In terms of the report, recommendation 16 refers to pension. It's already been raised the issue around whether or not survivors will be beneficial. Could I stress that needs looking at? Secondly, recommendation 28 on financial compensation. The MOD set the committee a maximum of £50 million, or a cap on what could be paid in compensation. Can I urge the Secretary of State not to actually use that as a way of keeping compensation payments down to keep their Treasury happy? And also, could he also just clarify, I know the Veterans Minister is not here today for this announcement, who is actually going to implement these recommendations?
Secretary of State.
Look, I'm happy to write to him to clarify pathways for the pension. I think that's quite important. Look, on the financial award, I think first and foremost we recognise there should be a financial award. The second thing, as I said earlier in the dispatch box, I think it's important we work with people like Fighting the Pride to work through how we can do it. The Veterans Minister is sitting right above you, almost right above you, and move to the right a bit to do that. And the implementation will be predominantly Ministry of Defence, but cross-government for some of the other recommendations. And like you and I will write to the Treasury, no doubt, from the backbenches.
Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his courage and his openness, and also the work of my right honourable friend for Plymouth Moor. This was incredibly difficult reading, and we are a proud serving and military community in Rutland, Melton, the Vale and Harbour villages. Can I take this opportunity to recognise that community and put on record that we see you, we hear you, and it is the senior military of that time who stole careers, who stole futures, and who are the ones who should feel shame, not those who served and sought to serve our country. Can I also take this chance to put on record the sorrow of this House that the same ban was put on diplomatic staff, and an apology only came forward in 2021, and we see them and we thank them for their work. Can I ask my right honourable friend, we work and train and equip many militaries around the world who continue to persecute LGBT people who simply want to protect their people. What are we doing to make sure that when we train and equip those militaries and we work with them, that we do now allow them to repeat the mistakes that we made?
Secretary of State.
First of all, my honourable friend, her last point is, I think, incredibly valid. Yes, we train people all over the world to protect their societies, but what is the point of it if we don't also train them to uphold international humanitarian or human rights laws? I do know that on many occasions we do that. I once stood in Lebanon listening to former British soldiers under a British scheme training the Lebanese army about human rights. And I think that is incredibly important. Otherwise, what is it all for in the first place? And look, I understand her point about the senior commanders. I think that would be wrong to just focus on one cohort. I think ultimately, institutionally, the organisation, the culture, the mindset, society's mindset that affected diplomats and judiciary and everything else was collectively responsible for the environment that led to this. And I think every one of us, including me as a rather junior officer who didn't have a role, didn't come across someone that was going to be locked up or prosecuted ever, I take responsibility as much as the senior people who made the policies of the department.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome this statement, and I sincerely welcome the manner in which it's been delivered, and I think it shows the leadership qualities of the Defence Secretary, which have been all too lacking in many other leading politicians in recent times. I want to pay tribute to my constituent Simon Hinchley-Robson, who urged me to bring his case to the floor of this House in an adjournment debate. He was horribly physically abused after being outed by a doctor who had given him a medical examination and then summarily dismissed from the RAF. He was denied his pension and his opportunity to serve his country, and he, like many others, deserves redress. What I don't want to see is a similar case to a situation that we're in with contaminated blood, which is going on interminably, with Grenfell, the post office case. So what can the Secretary of State say today to ensure that we won't see that sort of delay and obfuscation in this case?
Secretary of State.
Well, some of the delay and obfuscation was driven by a rush to get a scheme to satisfy speed. It wasn't always deliberate, the obfuscation. If you write these things wrong, as we have seen, as you say, a whole list of them, I think your honourable friend next to you, I remember campaigning on the vibrating white finger scandal, right? The intention was good. The lawyers were the ones who profited. And so we've got to get it right. And I think that's right. On the pension rights of the individual, if he would like to write to me on behalf of his constituent, personally write to me, I will make sure, because as I've said, their pension rights were not taken away from them. They may have been informed. We must make sure they're not. And if there's a reason they were, I'm very happy to explore making sure it's restored to him.
Matt Warman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whether it's the cadets or the Battle Britain Memorial Flight or the Red Arrows, the reach of the military is far beyond simply its own personnel. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the least the military can do in light of today's report is to use that influence to try and break down broader anti-LGBT prejudice in our society?
Look, yeah, I totally agree, Madam Speaker. The thing you want to do when you join the armed forces is belong. The first thing one of the best things you do in your basic training is when somebody finally gives you your berry or you finally pass your weapons test. And believe it or not, being on guard for the first time seems to be you're treated like a proper soldier and you just want to belong. The fact you all look the same in the same uniform is actually part of the attraction. And that has to be the quality that we sell to people. It doesn't matter if you are gay or straight or whatever you are. It doesn't matter. You are part of the collective defence of this fine nation and those values. And the Red Arrows and Trooping the Colour and all those things that are the symbol and the cadet forces should all be about, in a sense, belonging to one thing.
Tamarjeet Singh Dassi.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, LGBT plus veterans were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, to risk their life to protect our country. They were our nation's heroes, but they suffered such a gross injustice. I'm proud that Labour repealed the ban against LGBT plus service personnel in 2000 and welcomed the Etherton review when it was first launched. But does the Defence Secretary agree that the very much welcome apology by the Prime Minister today is merely the first step in this healing process as we attempt to correct this historic wrong? But does he also acknowledge that how compensation is dealt with will be the true barometer of the success of how the government is dealing with our LGBT plus veterans?
Secretary of State.
First of all, the true barometer will be all 49 recommendations and how we implement them and the spirit. Yes, financial reward will be part of it, but also the restoration, the valuing of those people are for some just as important. And look, I heard his point. Look, not a single other person in this debate has talked about party politics. They haven't mentioned a political party. And my point about the overall culpability of society was my party opposed lifting the ban, his party opposed lifting the ban. It was the European Court of Human Rights that ruled against them and forced them to do it. I came to this House in a spirit of honesty and openness about the culpable of society. Let's not make it party political.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome this apology, which will go some way into correcting the hurt that our veterans faced. And as a proud member of the AFPS scheme on the Royal Navy branch, I've seen firsthand what a vital role that our LGBT personnel have in their jobs. Can I now ask what efforts the Secretary of State is making to ask his service chiefs to redouble their efforts in making our armed forces even more welcoming for LGBT people in recruitment going forward?
Secretary of State.
Well, we have a strong and dynamic D&I plan to make sure we talk about it, and sometimes we get criticised, and it is not an easy line to follow, as we saw in the RAF in the recruitment issue about promoting more women recruits. We are guided by the Equality Act, but we are also guided by the desperate need and importance of having the whole of society in our armed forces. I wouldn't appoint a Chief of the General Staff or First Sea Lord or Chief of the Air Staff if they did not wholeheartedly believe in having a diverse armed forces community. They would not get past me in the appointment process. And as I finish this job, I've appointed all the chiefs in the armed forces, and every single one of them embraces that requirement and actions it.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I mention my political party only to associate the Liberal Democrats with the comments by the Defence Secretary. And I should add that I respect him a great deal, and I thank him for what in another career would be referred to as long service and good conduct. My thoughts are with former LGBT service personnel whose family members died before the policy changed and before the apology was made. I wonder whether discussions have been had with homelessness charities, such as St Petrock's in Devon, about identifying veterans who were dishonourably discharged and have found themselves on the streets.
Secretary of State.
I think some of these recommendations are going to be cross-government, and as he rightly points out, homelessness. And I think it's going to be really important. The Minister of Defence and my right honourable friend, the Minister for Personnel and Veterans, will also work very closely with the Veterans Office of Veterans Affairs Minister to make sure that we have that grip, not just across national government, but local government as well. Because I think if we're going to really implement some of these recommendations, it really does require that whole of not only the government sector, but also the charitable sector approach.
Anthony Mangnall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I absolutely support the Defence Secretary's campaign to put up a statue of Dr Turing in Trafalgar Square, if that's what he's launching. The apology today is particularly welcome, and it will make a huge difference. But there is a large part of the community who left the military of their own accord, who weren't hounded out, who didn't have marks on their service record, and I think this report has to ensure that it takes them into account, because they left and gave up successful long careers in the military because they felt the environment wasn't supportive of them. Can he reassure me and my constituents that this report will make sure they are kept in consideration?
Secretary of State.
Yeah, my honourable friend makes a actually really important point, but also a difficult point, which is I think during the review, Lord Etherton, obviously there were people who were formally discharged, and there aren't that many who were formally discharged to the route. There were others who were elbowed out, who were fitted up or set up, or they were pushed out with other offensive, and there were others who just said, I am unwelcome and I'm leaving. I think the first of all is those people will know who they are, and I hope they read this report. And this report is a really easy and good report to read. Someone said long reading over the summer. Not at all. It won't take you long to read Lord Etherton's report. It is a good report to do it. And so first of all, I hope that they read that report. They also use the government website and also that they find a way they can come forward and talk about their experience. And we have to find a way to make it up to them if there is something they need.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Speaker. As my honourable friend opposite has already said, one of the most humbling and inspiring experiences you can have as a parliamentarian, I believe, is taking part in our Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. Earlier this year, along with colleagues, I had the immense privilege of observing our Marines in Norway as part of their cold weather deployment training. There we got to meet our proud service personnel, lesbian, gay and trans service personnel, who are proud to serve our nations, and our nation should be proud of them. They spoke of how the culture has quite rightly changed, and I thank the Secretary of State for taking part in that culture change and making that culture change happen. But there's always more to do. So for his successor, what can we do to ensure that all of our armed forces, from our cadet forces to our everything, is an inclusive and free of discrimination?
Secretary of State.
I think the first thing to do is exposure to everybody, to the community, for people to be able to talk about their sexuality and their experiences without fear or hindrance. You know, if I look at my children's experiences and my children's ability to talk about a whole range of things, they're very different from my generation. And I think that is because these things are much more acceptable to be talked about and things. And I think every time a soldier in training meets someone from the LGBT community who's sitting next door to them or is on a patrol with them, that is the strongest way to change the culture. So the first challenge is let's get more people joining from the LGBT community into our armed forces, and that will help change the culture for good.
Elliot Colwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also thank my right honourable friend for the candour that he has displayed in the way he's brought forward this important report, which has been warmly welcomed by LGBT plus veterans in Carshalton and Wellington. But could I press the Defence Secretary on the issue around marriage on the defence estate? I know that 3 marriages have happened since the change of regulations in 2014, and yet the defence estate still does not allow civil marriages or civil partnerships to take place on the estate, and that has a particular impact on the LGBT plus community. I know that he's already looking at this, but can he just give us some reassurances that the MOD will continue to work to make this policy more inclusive?
Secretary of State.
No, I totally hear what he's saying, and I've just made certain decisions which I can't yet talk about around exactly that, because it's complicated about the relationship between the church within the military and the church premises, etc. I'm very happy to write to him and set out the details. My intention is that these military premises or church premises should be open to administer marriages, etc., to all orientations.
Ashley Dalton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wish to acknowledge the campaigning work of LGBT veterans and others in campaigning on this issue, and add my voice to the thanks to Lord Etherton for this excellent report. It's welcome and it's much needed. The Secretary of State in his statement committed to a zero-tolerance approach to LGBT plus discrimination in the armed forces, and also just now has talked about culture change in the armed forces. Now, as LGBT people, we don't just come out once. We have to come out over and over again, sometimes several times in one day. And whilst I welcome the Secretary of State's acknowledgement that LGBT plus people joining the military is much welcome, LGBT plus people cannot be responsible for tackling the culture change that's needed simply by turning up. So could he please outline what the government's doing today to make sure that the culture change that we so desperately need in our armed forces is taken place and that the government takes responsibility for it?
Secretary of State.
Well, some of what we're doing actually falls out of the very excellent work by my honourable friend, the member for Wrexham's work about women in the armed forces. The area of complaint, the area of allowing people to feel that they can make a complaint or about inappropriate behaviour, or where inappropriate behaviour is seen outside the chain of command. The service complaints route, which used to go via the chain of command, which caused all sorts of problems for people, understandably, about who do you complain to? Do you complain to your boss about their behaviour? Is part of that route about saying if you feel something is inappropriate, that you can make a proper complaint right through the system, and if senior officers or officers are not acting on those complaints, not only will that affect their career, because the Ombudsman can rule on that, but also something can be done. So first of all, I think it's about upholding the standards we wish and making sure that unacceptable behaviour is dealt with there and then on the spot. And I think that is the first thing, to make it a welcoming environment. The second thing is we make sure that when we are recruiting or when people are in training, that there is an appropriate level of training and support given to those people, and then making sure all the way through that the environment is equal. The same goes for married quarters, the same goes for the living accommodation people live in, is that they are treated absolutely the same without any discrimination at all, because ultimately it is about getting more people to join, but it's also about those people serving feeling welcome and not having to come out every few hours or days. And the one thing I can tell you, having been in an infantry regiment, is the people who know you best are the people you serve alongside. And in those units, you won't have to come out every hour or every day. They'll all know each other, and that is what sticks together, is your friendship and your bond, and sometimes that's formed under fire.
Sir Michael Fabric.
Thank you. Can I thank my right honourable friend for coming to the House today and also for the tone in which he has delivered this statement. And can I also tell him that two friends of mine, one a former naval intelligence officer and the other an NCO in the army, who had to leave under tragic circumstances, will both be very pleased with the apology that both he and the Prime Minister have given on behalf of the state. And finally, may I say to my right honourable friend, 25 years ago, a colonel in the Royal Marines said something to me, and I wonder whether he would agree with this. He said, in a firefight, I would rather have a gay Marine alongside me who can shoot straight than a straight Marine who can't.
Secretary of State.
As a Scots Guard, I better not make a comment on the Royal Marines. All I would say to my first whip when I joined this House is, first of all, look, I think that's the point, right? Isn't that the point? The point is the men and women of our armed forces all belong to a common endeavour to keep this country safe. That was what was forgotten in all those years. What matters is the skill they bring to bear to deal with the enemy. And as he says, I'd much rather everyone shot straight.
And finally, Jim Shannon.
Can I very much welcome the Secretary of State's tone, first of all, but the statement as well. I think everyone in the House welcomes that, and government's commitment to that is very clear. Unfortunately, over the last period of time, Madam Deputy Speaker, some veterans have unfortunately taken their own lives. Others have been discriminated against, been traumatised against. Their health has deteriorated. So my question to the Secretary of State is, can the Secretary of State pledge to help those who have offered their all for this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but who have felt on their own for just far too long?
Secretary of State.
Look, the feeling of rejection that those men and women must have felt will stay with many of them all their lives. And I think that is something that we have to do our very best to try and help and solve. I think it must be awful to think you are helping society and society telling you you don't belong at that time. So wherever they are, not only should we help look after them, and we should urge the regiments and everything else to get in touch with them, their Veterans Association. I'm president of the Scots Guards Association in Lancashire, to make sure we reach back out and ask them to rejoin the family if they feel excluded. And for those who've tragically taken their life, I think it goes to the heart of the importance of the suicide strategy that was raised at the time in today's Prime Minister's question, and make sure that we are alert to the needs of some of those people that are taking their own lives, not just for the time in their military, but maybe for that sign of rejection.
That concludes proceedings on the statement, and just one moment. And may I say, the whole House appreciates the way, the determination and sincerity with which the Secretary of State has come to the House today to make this statement himself. And may I say, on behalf of the whole House, if this is his last appearance at the dispatch box, which he predicts it might be, one never knows, it might be that the whole House will join me in wishing him all the very best. A point of order, Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It would have been out of order for me to have asked a question during the statement, because I'm afraid I was upstairs with some youngsters from my constituency. But would it be in order for me to join the general approbation of the Secretary of State for Defence? I do note that Elton John has said several times that he's done his last performance in his tour. So now that he is a gay hero, and we're all going to be buying him some LGBT jackets and shirts and rainbow flags, can I make a serious point about him, which is that he has probably been one of the very few people in this House who has been clear-sighted about Russia from the very beginning, from the very outset. And I feel sometimes that if the whole House had listened to him a bit more on Russia, Ukraine might have been in a better place than it is today. So if it's not too obsequious, can I just add my obsequies to everybody else's and praise the Secretary of State? Is that in order?
I think the Chamber will appreciate It's not in order at all. But I have exercised some leniency as we come to the end of this long session of Parliament and approach summer to allow the Right Honourable Gentleman to make his remarks, because I know that he makes them with sincerity, and I think that most of us would agree with him. It's not at all in order for me to say I agree with anything from the Chair. The Secretary of State knows that he leaves with the very good wishes of the whole of the House of Commons. Point of order, Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Earlier this morning, a note on parliamentary-headed notepaper and mug was sent to the press lobby from the SNP leader in Westminster referring to China's one-child policy. Madam Deputy Speaker, this was not what I came to Parliament to do, but sadly I've become used to calling out xenophobia and misogyny in this place and would be grateful for your guidance. Official statistics confirm that as a result of the one-child policy, there were 196 million sterilisations, 336 million abortions, all under China's one-child policy. It was a policy that broke families, led to infanticide, mostly baby girls. In 2017, there were still 33 million more men than there were women in China. When can our diverse communities expect better from members of Parliament, especially in understanding the history and trauma of other countries? Madam Deputy Speaker, is it really appropriate for the SNP leader in Westminster to use parliamentary stationery to make crass political jibes steeped in xenophobia and misogyny? Shouldn't we expect better, especially the East and South East Asian community, on this issue?
Further to that point of order, Mr Doherty Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Maybe you can clarify 2 points for me. Whether or not it's the British Labour Party is more rattled by a minor breach of the rules than they are by child poverty. And also critical in terms of quotes. In June, I believe in 2018, the following way said, "The cap reminds me of Communist China's morally abhorrent one-child policy." Now even the Chinese have abolished that. Perhaps the Tories can bring themselves to follow China's example and abolish the two-child cap. The leader, the deputy leader of the Scottish Labour Party. So maybe in answering these 2 questions, maybe we can find the member for Luton North, given the telephone number of the Labour's sub-branch office in Glasgow.
Order, 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 order. Neither of these matters are points of order for the Chair. I appreciate that they are matters on which members feel very strongly and wish to find an opportunity to criticise and to debate what is right and what is wrong in this matter. But of course it is not for the Chair to take any responsibility for members' correspondence with journalists, for example. But I would always, as the Speaker has done many times, urge responsible language in this House and by members outside this House. And if the Honourable Lady has a specific point about the use of parliamentary stationery, the way to deal with that is to write with evidence to Mr Speaker rather than to raise it on the floor of the House. Thank you. Point of order, Preet Gill.
On a point of order, Madam Deputy Speaker, could you please advise on how I can get hold of a response to my letter to the Immigration and International Development Minister dated the 2nd of March, that is 4.5 months ago, about the ballooning bill of aid for asylum hotels under their watch? Last year, donor refugee costs ballooned to $3.7 billion. The cost per person per night in asylum accommodation has gone up 5-fold in 4 years, and the case backlog still stands at 170,000. As we are a day from recess, I wonder whether you can advise me, Madam Deputy Speaker, on how I can get a timely response.
Can the Honourable Lady clarify her question? Was this a letter written personally by her on behalf of a particular constituent?
It was yes, of course, many constituents had written to me on this matter.
No, I'm asking her, was it about a named particular constituent?
It was in my capacity, in my role, but it was on behalf of many people that have written to me raising concerns.
No. Well, the point I'd like to make to the Honourable Lady is that, as has been said from this chair many, many times, the Speaker has repeatedly said that it is essential that ministers should answer correspondence in a tedious fashion, and 4.5 months is too long to wait. But I will make this point to the Honourable Lady. If every time a Member of Parliament wrote a general letter about a general matter to a minister and didn't get an immediate response, they raised a point of order here in the House, then we would have points of order for 2 hours every day. It is not a point of order. But I hope that the Honourable Lady will get an answer to her letter. But it's not a point of order, and members should not come to the Chamber to complain about a general matter, which is a matter for debate. We will now move to the 10-minute rule bill. Dame Maria Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the Sentencing Council to issue sentencing guidelines in respect of sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861 and for connected purposes. I'll start by saying what this bill is not doing to avoid any misunderstandings. It is not removing sections 58 and 59 of the 1861 Act. It is not changing any of the regulations on abortion set out in the 1967 Abortion Act, which allows in strict and limited circumstances abortions to take place, including time limits for those procedures. Now, I make absolutely no secret of wanting to see a far more wide-reaching reform than this bill delivers, taking women seeking abortion away from the sanctions of criminal law, and believe a great many members of Parliament agree with me on that too. I had drawn up that bill, and I had planned it to bring it forward today, but that wasn't possible, despite widespread concern, cross-party support, so that has to wait yet again. So what does this bill do? This bill solely relates to the sentencing under the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, the criminal law underpinning abortion in the UK. The effect of this bill is to ensure there is sentencing guidance in place for judges to use in court. Sentencing guidance from the Sentencing Council, something entirely proper for Parliament to legislate on. Whilst I would prefer complete reform, I also believe as parliamentarians we have a duty to scrutinise how the current law is working and to make the changes that are possible when problems emerge. When it comes to the medical procedure of abortion, we should not be surprised that having law that is 160 years old underpinning a medical procedure causes problems for the courts. The law has to evolve to better reflect modern-day Britain, to be compassionate, for it to be applied with an understanding of the medical context today. At the moment, there is no such sentencing guidance in place, and with little case law to draw upon, we leave judges bearing the brunt of trying to interpret legislation agreed in this place more than 150 years ago, when the world of women's health was a very, very different place. Sentencing guidance helps to ensure consistency in how the law is applied today. The Council's founding legislation, the Coroners and Justice Act 2009, is clear that the Sentencing Council must publicly consult on new guidance to ensure professional and public views are properly taken into account and, where necessary, then adjust. As we saw in the recent case of Carla Foster, the judge specifically cited the lack of guidance in his sentencing remarks. Now, if there had been sentencing guidance in place, perhaps Ms Foster would not have had to endure weeks of prison away from her children, waiting for the Court of Appeal to decide yesterday that her initial sentence should be halved and that it should be a suspended sentence, meaning that she should not be in prison at all. Dame Victoria Sharp, one of the appeal court judges, called, in her own words, for compassion, not punishment. If sentencing guidance had been in place for the judge at the initial sentencing, it is possible that this heartbreaking situation could have been avoided altogether. Now, the measures in this bill today already enjoy widespread support. The Shadow Leader of the House, who I can see in her place, and I'm informed that I'd refer to her in my speech, called for exactly the change that I have in this bill just a few weeks ago. and has been clear about the official opposition's support for sentencing guidelines. And I'll quote the Honourable Member for Bristol West's remarks from Hansard for accuracy following the sentencing of Carla Foster. And I quote, "In the wake of this awful case, I hope the government will be in a position to take action at least on sentencing guidelines. This is too important an issue to play politics on. Labour is willing to work with the government," end quote. The government has not brought forward such measures because, and they're absolutely clear, any changes on law relating to abortion must be above party politics and come from the backbenches. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is why I am standing here today. To get action, such as the action the Honourable Lady for Bristol West talked about in her remarks, to get action for women up and down the country who are fearful when they read of the plight of Carla Foster, who need to consult a doctor about abortion and may have been absolutely unaware of the sentencing gap, or indeed completely unaware of the criminal law that is in place. And I hope that the Honourable Lady for Bristol West's support for the sentencing guidance extends to my bill before the House today, though of course I understand it is an issue of conscience. I'm extremely grateful for those right honourable and honourable members who have indicated their support for this bill from across the House, including the Father of the House. Now, some have their own experience to draw on, others, through their constituents, see firsthand how the current situation doesn't work. Now, members, most notably the Honourable Member for Walthamstow, who's in her place, have shown how distinct and deliberate steps are important in changing attitudes on abortion, and I applaud the work that she does. And I believe this is another distinct step forward from where we are today and would see women given better certainty whilst we wait for fuller reform to achieve agreement in this House. Now, of course, I am immensely grateful to the Right Honourable Member for Peckham and Camberwell, the mother of the House, for her fulsome support and expert guidance in how to take forward this bill with the Sentencing Council. And I hope the Sentencing Council agrees to meet us to consider a way forward with the responsible minister, who I think may be sitting on the front bench. It's worth dwelling on the context of the 1861 Act for a moment. The reason this law was passed and put in place in the first place was to protect women. Women who are far more likely to die as a result of a barbaric abortion than during childbirth, at a time when women were actually still forbidden by law to even take part in the debate that happened in this Parliament. Now, things today could not be more different. Women can debate and regularly do debate women's health issues. But what's even more important is that we now live in a time when abortion is far less dangerous than giving birth. So there's been a complete change. And this bill matters because the fair and equal treatment of women matters. Abortion is the only medical procedure in the UK subject to the criminal law. Women who find themselves having an abortion outside of the law for whatever reason deserve our compassion, not punishment, to quote the words of that appeal court judge. And it is difficult to understand how society would ever be best served by placing a woman in prison after she'd experienced a pregnancy loss for whatever reason. She deserves our support and compassion, not imprisonment. But these are matters for the Sentencing Council to consult on and to decide on based on expert knowledge. The bill I present to Parliament today is not a panacea for the significant differences between the law and medical opinion on abortion, and it doesn't pretend to be. But the bill does demonstrate to those who we expect to interpret the law that we understand we make it very difficult for them. This bill is a small step in the right direction to get a better balance between public opinion, medical opinion and the law. And I believe, and I hope the House will unite to agree it should proceed. Our job as parliamentarians, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to find solutions, not to define problems. To find common ground, to work together to establish consensus where it may not be obvious and easy to find. And in the words of the prayers we start every session with, laying aside all private interests and prejudice, keep in mind our responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all mankind and indeed all womankind too. Thank you.
Question is that the Right Honourable Member have leave to bring in the bill. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise with great sadness to oppose this legislation for 4 very specific reasons on behalf of many members of this House who believe, like the member opposite, that there is much agreement that there is a problem that needs to be resolved, but fear that this approach might actually end up making things worse. Can I start by recognising and respecting the work of the member opposite? I've been proud to stand with her on this issue over many different points through the years. But our fear is that this bill fails to solve and possibly makes worse by normalising the biggest problem of all. That is why we have not received any representations in support of this approach from those working on these issues. Because the central problem that we face is not that there are no sentencing guidelines, it's that there is sentencing at all. The Offence Against the Person Act 1861 is not a foundation on which any sensible modern law about abortion can be made because it is not about healthcare. It's legislation that also criminalises placing wood on a railway with intent to cause danger or casting stones on a railway carriage, obstructing a clergyman or assaulting a seaman. Alongside that, it criminalises a healthcare decision. You can be deeply opposed to abortion and still recognise that no other healthcare begins with an offence and then goes on to medical regulation. You can also be concerned with the conduct of the defendant in the recent case that sparked this case, resolute, as we all are, that there should be time limits for abortion, and still think that the Offence Against the Person Act should be repealed. We have other offences for those who seek to force women to have abortions, indeed including those who have abortions past the term limit. But my first reason to oppose this is that sentencing normalises that women continue to be prosecuted under this legislation and so investigated for a crime even if they don't end up in court. Sentencing guidelines would only affect those women convicted. Guidelines would do nothing to halt the growing number of women investigated for having an abortion or a stillbirth or indeed a miscarriage under this law. Freedom of Information data shows us there have been 67 prosecutions in the UK in the last 10 years, but many more women have been investigated. The Home Office tells us that in 2021 alone, 40 women were investigated. We currently know of 2 live prosecutions. That's where there have been no decision as to whether to charge these women under this legislation. But sentencing guidelines would not deal with the hostile atmosphere women are facing. We can see this in the recent guidelines issued by the Chief Coroner on the need to report live births following determinations, which state a lawful termination of pregnancy under the Abortion Act of 1967 can trigger a coroner's duty to investigate. This guidance means bereaved parents could end up facing a coroner's inquest and entangled in a lengthy criminal justice system because of criminalisation, the connection made between reproductive loss and prosecution. That's why a 15-year-old girl who suffered a stillbirth at 28 weeks suffered a year-long investigation by the police that was eventually dropped only after a post-mortem found that her pregnancy loss was due to natural causes. She's still in emotional pressure as a result of that. And there is no distinction in these laws between reproductive loss that is self-induced and prosecutions of men who provoke a miscarriage, meaning that it leads to the potential prosecution of domestic violence victims. Because of this law, across the country, women are having their medical records accessed and being interviewed because they've experienced baby loss, and the existence of 58 and 59 of this Act, and how it frames how public agencies approach women. But my second argument is even if we just focus on keeping women out of prison under this outdated legislation, we're still equating abortion with a criminal act like damaging property or stalking or theft by suggesting community sentencing. Indeed, Carla Foster has got a suspended sentence which involves 50 days of rehabilitation activity. A woman with a community sentence still has a criminal record. It's still classed as a conviction. It remains on the police national computer indefinitely and can be used in future criminal proceedings. It has to be declared to employers and financial institutions and could prohibit future work with children. She could be subject to curfews, obliged to live at a particular address, prohibited from travelling overseas, forbidden from taking part in certain activities at certain venues. You could be disbarred as a solicitor. It could affect your DBS, and your ability as an employer to discriminate on the basis of criminal convictions means that women having abortions could be discriminated against.
This approach reinforces the idea that it is a shame in having an abortion rather than a choice. Now, even if you think that is acceptable, my third concern is that, especially since yesterday's successful appeal by Carla Foster, we do actually have case law on which sentencing can be based. Of the need, as the member opposite said, for compassion, not punishment in the application of this. The Sentencing Council is an independent body, so there is no guarantee that they would agree with the approach that many of us would like to see and put forward here today. It could open a can of worms as to what that sentence could be. And frankly, those women currently facing a court case would not be helped by this legislation anytime because of the length of time it takes to develop sentencing guidelines. For motoring offences, it was 11 months. For animal cruelty, over a year. Perverting the course of justice, a recent one in March 2023, another one, over a year. And my final concern, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that looking at sentencing directly contradicts the call for decriminalisation and the case for equalising the human rights of women in the United Kingdom, because women in Northern Ireland would never face a prosecution or indeed an investigation under this legislation because they have had this repealed. Madam Deputy Speaker, I do not propose to divide the House on this matter, though I know there are many opinions about the way forward, because I do recognise behind this legislation is an ambition that we all share, that the current situation is untenable. Yeah. But I cannot support this bill, and I know many others can't, and I urge the government not to go down this path as a response, but instead to enable the House, as the member opposite agrees, to have a vote from the backbenches, a matter of conscience on whether to equalise abortion rights across the United Kingdom, and allow many of us who voted for them in Northern Ireland to be extended to our constituents so that we can uphold the human rights of women everywhere. We know the public are with us, and we know that those who oppose abortion on principle will continue to do it whatever the proposal. But we also know the time for real courage and real change is now, because the women facing investigations who will not be helped by sentencing guidelines, the women frightened that their rights are at risk, need and deserve nothing less.
Hear, hear. The question is that the Right Honourable Member have leave to bring in the bill. As mayors that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Sir Peter Bottomley, Harriet Harman, Caroline Noakes, Sarah Champion, Vera Hobhouse, Tracy Crouch, Dame Caroline Dinage, Matt Warman, Christine Jardine, Nikki Aitken, Theo Clark, and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Dame Maria Miller.
Offences Against the Person Act 1861 Sentencing Guidelines Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 24th of November, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Friday the 24th of November. Thank you. We now come to motion number 2, business of the House today. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
The question is as on the order paper. As mayors of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
As mayors of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And so we come to motion number 3 on sanctions. Minister to move, Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the committee has considered the Russia Sanctions EU Exit Amendments Regulations 2023. These amend the Russia Sanctions EU Exit Regulations 2019. This instrument was laid on the 29th of June 2023 under powers in the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018. The measures in this instrument entered into force on the 30th of June 2023. These measures have been coordinated with our international partners, Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst refining the approach to accommodate the particular circumstances of the UK's legal sector. By restricting access to additional services from the UK, they will contribute to increasing the pressure on Putin for waging his illegal and brutal war against Ukraine. These measures place further constraints on the Russian economy and therefore Putin's war machine. They add force to the largest, most substantial package of economic sanctions that Russia has ever faced. Madam Deputy Chair, this instrument delivers on the commitment made by the UK Government to ban legal advisory services on specified commercial activities. This will further hamper the ability of Russian businesses to operate internationally. This legislation will make it illegal for any person working in the UK, as well as all British nationals working abroad, to advise on or facilitate certain commercial activities that would be sanctioned by the UK Government if they involved a British national entity or were taking place in the UK. In practice, Madam Deputy Speaker, this will make it harder for Russia to benefit from the UK's world-class legal expertise. This goes beyond prohibitions already in place, which cover a range of professional services, including accountancy, architecture and management consultancy. This latest measure demonstrates our determination to ratchet up pressure on Putin for continuing his illegal war. Although this legislation will close down opportunities for Putin's associates and supporters to benefit commercially from the UK's legal expertise, it is important that we ensure that legal services can continue to be provided where they contribute to upholding the rule of law and compliance with our sanctions framework. By protecting the fundamental right to legal representation, we distinguish ourselves from Putin's oppressive regime. By ensuring legal advice can continue to be provided for the purposes of compliance with our sanctions framework, we enhance the effectiveness of our regulations and intensify the pressure on Putin. Legal professionals are under a strict obligation to ensure their services support their clients to be sanctions compliant and do not stray into enabling them to circumvent restrictions. Madam Deputy Speaker, it has become apparent, however, that the legislation can be interpreted as having the unintended consequence of prohibiting persons in the UK and British nationals abroad from providing legal advice to clients seeking to comply with the sanctions regimes of our international partners. It is not the intent of these regulations to prohibit this type of legal service. UK lawyers should be able to support their clients to be sanctions compliant beyond UK law as we work closely with our allies to tighten the net on Russia's economy. We have looked at this issue thoroughly, and as an immediate response we are working across government and alongside representatives of the legal sector to implement a general licence that will make clear that this type of activity can continue. Yes, of course.
Very grateful because she's addressing the point that the Law Society has made to quite a few of us, and I guess quite a few of us are going to be referring to this a little bit later. I just wonder, because we would have tabled an amendment if this had been primary legislation, isn't it normally better for us to do all of this scrutiny of this kind of work on primary legislation rather than secondary legislation? Because then we can always help the government get it right first time.
The Honourable Gentleman is generous as ever in offering to assist us to make progress, and I hope that as we bring this secondary legislation into place, it will be another step as we move towards tightening the pressure on those who would wish to use legal representation for the wrong things. Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable for giving way. Can I say I welcome her willingness to engage around the general licence. This is very important to the Law Society, and for good and sound reasons. We all share the policy objective. We should perhaps agree to meet, both at an official and at a ministerial level, with representatives of the Law Society, so we can thrash out exactly the detail and get it right.
I will be happy to do so. I know that as we are bringing this, we aim to have this in place in the coming days. As I said, we're working closely with the legal sector for its constructive engagement on this important issue, and I'm happy to commit to the officials meeting with the Law Society to hear their particular concerns, and indeed I have no doubt offers of their views of how we can best make this as effective as possible. Madam Deputy Speaker, once we have issued the licence, we will consider whether amendments to the SI to address the issue are appropriate and necessary, and we'll do this in conjunction with the legal sector and bring these forwards if we need to at the earliest opportunity. As with all our sanctions, this latest package has been developed in coordination with our international partners, and in doing so we will continue to work with the legal community to monitor the effects of this legislation in order to ensure that it is achieving its objectives. We will also continue to coordinate with our international allies to identify and address any gaps or loopholes that emerge in our respective sanctions regimes. Madam Deputy Chair, to conclude, this latest measure demonstrates our determination to target those who participate in, facilitate Putin's illegal war of choice. Through our sanctions regime and those of our allies, Russia is increasingly isolated, cut off from Western markets, services and supply chains. Key sectors of the Russian economy have taken a significant hit and its economic outlook is bleak. The UK government will use sanctions to intensify the military and economic pressure on Russia until Putin ends his brutal invasion of Ukraine. We welcome the clear and continued cross-party support for this course of action and the sanctions regimes, and I commend these regulations to the committee.
The question is, as on the order paper. Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for setting out the measures we are debating today. And as the House rises for a recess later this week, I'm pleased that we can meet before that, not only to debate new and welcome sanctions measures, but also to reiterate our unwavering commitment and solidarity with Ukraine. It's for its people and for its sovereignty. And the NATO Vilnius summit last week underscored the strength of feeling across our diplomatic and military alliances that we must stand with Ukraine in all measures, economic, military, humanitarian and diplomatic, until this war is won, and provide the necessary guarantees that they need. And I'm also pleased in that regard, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the House had the opportunity last week to explore and debate the Foreign Affairs Committee's report on the issue of illicit finance, the government's response and the need to crack down on Russian money and dirty Russian money within our economy, and the serious problems that we've had with London as a location for that, and the whole ecosystem that has facilitated that over many years. But on these measures today, again, as I have done on many occasions, be absolutely clear that we will support the government where we think they've got things right on sanctions, and will not seek to divide the House on this measure today. But I do have some questions for the Minister. It shouldn't be permissible that over 500 days into this conflict, it would be potentially lawful for a UK legal services provider to support commercial activities which advanced Russian state interests, and Russian interests of those who support this egregious and barbaric war in Ukraine, just because the said activity didn't have a sufficiently tangible connection to the UK due to the territorial application of the 2019 regulations. It must be the case that no UK person or person in the UK can provide legal advisory services to an activity which would be prohibited under our regime. And so I do hope the Minister can say why it's taken so long to bring forward this measure. I accept that the sanctions regime is a constantly evolving feast. We've had this debate many times, Madam Deputy Speaker, but this is obviously a significant potential risk. So I hope she can explain what has happened in terms of the timing on this. Secondly, I welcome her clarification regarding a general licence and the discussions that are going to be had. I know this will be raised and has been raised by other honourable and right honourable members about the concerns expressed regarding the ability to access legal advice for positive purposes, let's put it that way. But I do, on the other hand, Madam Deputy Speaker, have some questions regarding the issue of licences and exemptions that have been granted, including for access to legal services, which have been issued in the past, and the ministerial oversight of those. And of course, one of those in particular was in January this year, Madam Deputy Speaker. It came to light that the Treasury had issued special licences that allowed Prigozhin, the leader of the brutal Wagner group, exemptions and licences to acquire legal support. In fact, I believe it was flown to him in Russia at the time to sue his critics here in the UK. Obviously a completely unacceptable situation. So I hope that the Minister can explain, given the questions that I and others have raised about this in the past, what role ministers are now taking in the issuing of exemptions and licences. She's obviously going to be involved in developing the general licence she talked about for legitimate purposes, but I'm asking at the other end of the spectrum, there are an awful large number of licences that have been granted. I hope perhaps she could write to me, write to the House, with a full list of licences and exemptions that have been granted, for what purposes those have been granted, and also clarify whether ministers, particularly in her department, are now having oversight over those, and it's not just being done by officials, because these are obviously significant matters, and we don't want to see anything sneak through which is going to facilitate or aid Russian activities. Secondly, I hope that she can explain how the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation are monitoring the utility of the various exemptions which have been issued under the sanctions regimes, and whether they are enhancing the sanctions regime or indeed potentially in some cases, and I hope this is not the case, undermining it, and must be taking constant reflection and refinement on this, and ensuring that whilst we have the strongest text for these sanctions, that in terms of their actual application, that is being done in the most effective way to tackle the aggressor in this case. And while I'm on the subject of exemptions and loopholes, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the last committee debate we had on these measures, the Minister did commit to write to me regarding some serious concerns I raised about third countries being used as a way of avoiding our sanctions regimes in a number of product areas, and that would of course be interested in terms of the services sector and the legal services that we're referring to today, but of course it applies around a number of goods as well, and I hope she'll be able to write to me hopefully before the recess with answers on those questions, because they are significant. But Madam Deputy Speaker, as the House is about to write for recess, I want to reiterate the commitment of the official opposition of the Labour Party to work with the government in support for Ukraine, for its security, for its prosperity, for its future, and to cooperate in all measures against Russia and those who would aid and abet Putin's regime. We must continue to do this. We must continue to see that Russia and those who support Putin lose, and our sanctions regimes and the ways that those are applied are absolutely crucial to this. We must never allow London again to be part of an ecosystem of lawyers, of accountancy agencies, of company formation agents, of others who have facilitated the very people who have been behind the Russian regime and are ultimately aiding and abetting Putin.
Chairman of the Select Committee, Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say I welcome the tone and approach of the Minister's remarks, and I fully understand and support the policy objectives of this regulation, as does, I think, every decent lawyer in this country. I refer to my entry in the Register of Interest, of course, for completeness, because we want the UK legal system to retain its reputation as an able, efficient and honest jurisdiction, which it is. But it's important that we get the detail right, and so, with apologies as one fellow lawyer to another, Madam Deputy Speaker, you'll know if I say the detail matters sometimes. That's why there may be a little detail that I just want to raise with the Minister in the context of her very welcome assurance that she will meet and have officials meet to discuss what comes next. Because I appreciate these regulations rightly have had to be developed at some pace and have sought to be aligned with our allies, but there are some bits where I think further attention, if I may say, needs to be dealt with. I'm grateful to the Law Society of England and Wales for the briefing that they sent to a number of honourable members around this. Given that we all endorse the policy objective that Russia must never be allowed to gain from its barbaric and disgraceful invasion of Ukraine, and that Russian entities must never be able to allow to gain from that, given we accept that, we do have to do that in a way which retains the ability of UK-based international law firms to advise at the highest level of professionalism in the way in which, for example, clients may wish to divest themselves of interest in Russia, or to advise clients as to the risks or otherwise of potential transactions that might have an element with a Russian entity of one kind or another. It's in everybody's interest that they're able to do that. And that's where my concern and the concern of the Law Society is that some of the wording of the regulations, however well intended, and I think they're totally well intended, may have an unintended effect of limiting that. So, in particular, there is a concern that the language, very broad in this regulation, is actually broader than that of our counterparts in the United States and the EU in terms of the limitations. So, given the Minister is absolutely right to say that we should align, that's exactly something we now perhaps need to revisit. The licensing may be one way, a revised SI may be another, perhaps the two go together, to align the language. Because the practical consequence that should have, and I just want to set one or two of those out, is really this. If you look at what is Schedule 3J, paragraph 8A1A1, I think I got that right, of the regulations. This is in the detail, Madam Deputy Speaker, as you'll see. The language of the words are really quite important because essentially it prohibits advice which facilitates or enables activity that will be prohibited if it was conducted in the UK or by a UK person. Let's call it UK prohibited activity. And the other bit is it then, of course, goes on to say that it prohibits any advice in relation to or in connection with UK prohibited activity. And advice in that context includes the provision of legal advice, and here's the rub perhaps here, involving the application or interpretation of the law. Well, that is pretty much what lawyers do, really, hopefully, is advise people about the application and interpretation of the law. And early advice is the best way to prevent people getting into legal problems and to prevent needless litigation. There is, I accept, an exemption covering advice, but as the Minister will know, there's a real concern that the exemption is actually a very narrowly drawn one, and I would argue too narrow. What it means in practical terms is this, that, for example, British companies can't get advice from English and Welsh lawyers on whether their activity will comply with international sanctions regimes on the face of it. They could go to American lawyers to get that. And within the UK legal sector, we have many American-based law firms who have entered into the UK legal markets. It would be a bizarre situation that you can't go to the UK law firm to get that advice, but you go to the New York office of the American law firm, and on the face of it, you can. I don't think that was the intention behind the policy. We've got to make sure that the language reflects that intention. In the same way, if, for example, an international company wants to know whether a specific activity it's contemplating doing for perfectly good, legitimate commercial purposes is prohibited by UK, EU and US sanctions, all of which vary somewhat, the UK lawyer can answer whether or not it's prohibited by UK sanctions. But if somebody's come to me and said that, as a lawyer, once I say yes it is, you're not then allowed to go and advise as to whether it's prohibited by EU or US sanctions. Yeah, that can't be a sensible approach, can't be a practical approach, it can't be what the government actually wants to achieve. The whole advantage of the UK international law firms is, of course, they have many multidisciplinary lawyers, people qualified in many jurisdictions, and our strength is that people come to us because we can advise on a range of law, on a range of jurisdictions. But at the moment, you'll be committing an offence if you did the obvious step of going to say, OK, it's illegal in the UK, but I can't tell you whether it's illegal in the EU or the US. Now, that's clearly not a situation that anybody wants to see. And the difficulty is there is, of course, the language doesn't reflect, I think, the intention, because surely giving advice like that does not enable or facilitate the activity itself, the unlawful activity. What it does do is allow a company to know whether or not, if it does the activity, it might infringe the law, or whether or not the law is applicable to them, or not. But the language doesn't reflect that policy intention as it stands. There's another example, and if I can take the Minister and House to Regulation 60 DB brackets 3, close brackets, that's limited to advice. The exception, what we call the advice exception, is limited to advice to compliance with sanctions, not other forms of compliance advice. Again, the logic is you come to seek advice from your lawyer around the whole range of potential legal risks that you might run if you go down a particular course of commercial activity. The facts will be the same, and the facts may raise the issue that there is a question with sanctions and compliance there. But as it stands, of course, it's the Law Society's real concern, as it stands at the moment, the lawyer in the UK could only supply the client with advice on sanctions, not whether it complied with other criminal and other offences. So the strict wording at the moment of a regulation would, on the face of it, prohibit you giving advice, or criminalise you giving advice on whether or not this same form of action, as whether or not it falls foul of sanctions, might involve money laundering, anti-bribery laws, export control laws. Now, surely we want any UK lawyer to be able to give a one-stop shop, rolled-up advice on all the legal risks that might arise from that activity. But we're in the danger at the moment that once they've established the first part, that it falls foul of the UK sanctions regime, they can't go on and do what is the obvious and common sense thing and say, and by the way, you also fall foul of this, that and the other. That, again, can't be the intention. But as it stands, that's where we could end up. That's why the general licence in the short term is so important. Individual licences, which were referred to by the Shadow Minister, have been tried in the past. Not only is there a difficulty as to how effective they are in policy terms, there are practical difficulties as well. And that's where, for example, advice around disinvestment comes in, because UK companies might very properly want to withdraw from transactions involving Russian entities or individuals. Surely we want UK lawyers to be able to advise them fully and frankly as to how best they disinvest. But if you have to either be caught by the risk of a criminal sanction or get an individual licence, we know Russia, which is not a rule of law country, I think we put it mildly, is well able to take actions to sequester property, to prevent the return of assets of British nationals and British companies in a way that we would never countenance in this House. So when you're dealing with people of that kind, we don't have, frankly, the leisure. Once you've taken the decision to disinvest, you want to get the assets out quickly, and waiting for an individual licence wouldn't make that possible. So that's why the general licence rather than individual licence is important. That's why sitting down with the Law Society and say, look, here's the lived experience of law firms in the UK is the important thing to do, to get the regime right so that it sticks. Because sadly and regrettably, this war may go on for longer than any of us would wish, and therefore the sanctions will have to go on for longer we wish, but however long it takes, frankly, to get Ukraine its freedom and to get rid of that wretched regime in the Kremlin. So we have to have something that's going to stand the test of time. That's why I'm so anxious that the Minister does engage in some detail with the Law Society about it. I think the final point that I made, and the final example would be this. You could have a situation with an EU firm based in the UK. They can go to their Paris office and get advice on a different terms of legal trade to the UK office. That can't be to the advantage of the UK legal system, and it actually doesn't help us align with our allies. So, whilst welcoming and having actually greatly shortened the briefing that I've got, in the sense of everybody wanting to get away for the summer recess, but I hope I've flagged up that there are serious practical points here. There is an issue of principle, but there is the detail matters, as I said earlier on, Madam Deputy Speaker, and if we can work together to get that right, then I hope we can come back to the House after the recess at some point with the general licence and with a revised approach to the SI, which will give us a permanent system to bear down on the evil of the Russian regime, whilst doing so and actually enabling British lawyers to play their part in that fight with the expertise that they have, where at the moment they might find one hand tied behind their back, which was not the intention of the government.
SNP spokesman Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the knowledgeable and right honourable member for Bromley and Chislehurst and his legal expertise. I hope the Minister has been reading. I can now take 3 pages of notes out of my speech that I was going to deliver. But in all seriousness, this is a serious issue. For the Scottish National Party, our stance has always been clear, unambiguous and unwavering. We vehemently support the principles of democracy, peace and the rule of law, and we unyieldingly oppose any entity or individual that would act to undermine these bedrock principles. And with the indulgence of the Deputy Speaker, I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the context here. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 22 was a blatant breach of these principles and an affront to the international community. The unjust, unprovoked aggression caused immense pain, loss and destruction to the people in the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. Now, there is much more that the UK government could and should do. We've heard from the Labour front bench about the lack of action, in my view, of precaution, and of course the issue about dealing with third countries as well. And as we've just heard, there is a lot more detail, which I'll return to in a moment. There is a need for this to be properly scoped and for the detail to be agreed and as quickly as possible, because again, one of the things that's been lacking is perhaps the appropriate speed in delivering some of these sanctions that are so greatly needed. So it's in this context that we put our support behind the Russia Sanctions EU Exit Amendment number 3, Regulations 2023. This amendment furthers the United Kingdom's stance that Russia bears full responsibility for the damage that it's wrought to Ukraine. This isn't a matter of politics, it's a matter of basic human rights and justice, and we believe that those who cause harm should be held accountable and made to pay restitution. By supporting this amendment, I mean, we're not just voting for sanctions, we're voting ultimately for justice for Ukraine. We do note and support the provision for a defence under Section 68(1) of the Customs and Excise Management Act 1979 relating to the prohibition on exportation of certain goods to the non-government controlled areas. We believe this is a thoughtful addition that ensures that sanctions don't inadvertently penalise innocent parties and provides fair balance in these extraordinary circumstances. But again, we wait to see the legal detail as it unfolds. Since the start of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the SNP has consistently backed the government's sanctions regime against the Kremlin. We see this amendment as a natural and necessary extension, albeit, again, I believe there's more that can be done and should be done by the government, but it's a meaningful extension of this stand. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, the SNP supports this amendment. We stand for justice, peace, and for holding those accountable who disregard those values. We stand with Ukraine and will, as indicated, support the Sanctions EU Exit Amendment number 3, Regulations 2023. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just want to comment very briefly on the comment that the Minister made about international partners and our relationship with them. The Council of Europe recently held a summit in Reykjavik, at which the UK attended, and the UK signed the declaration that came out of that. Now, the Council of Europe has always seen this as a rule of law issue. They've seen sanctions as a rule of law issue because Russia has acted illegally in invading Ukraine. And they have had a tremendously robust response, not least of all from me. I was the first member of the Council of Europe to call for Russia to be expelled from the Council. And what that has meant is that the Reykjavik summit asked member governments to come up with legislation to support them and everyone actually in the rule of law issue by bringing out the legislation to make sure that these changes happened. And I'm very glad to see that we have done that, and this is a very good change that we have seen in this. So I just hope that the Minister will include the Council of Europe as part of the international partners with which she will maintain contact, because they have a vast amount of expertise. It isn't just me. There are lots of very distinguished members there who have a vast expertise in dealing with Russia and in dealing with these issues, and I hope that she will use them and feed into them, because I think there is a lot, subject to what we have just heard, that there is a lot that we can do to set a model that other countries can use in this.
Sir Chris Bryant.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a great joy to follow the Honourable Member for Henley, and since we've been in quite a valedictory mood today already, with the Secretary of State for Defence earlier on, it is a sadness that he's not going to be with us in the next Parliament. Obviously, I want Labour to take every seat in the land, so I don't want to go too far.